The firelight flickers against the rough stone of the cave wall, casting long, dancing shadows that seem to tell their own stories, stories older than the words we know how to speak. And outside, the air hangs heavy and still, smelling of damp pine needles and the deep, rich scent of thawing earth, while the only sound is the rhythmic, settling crackle of the burning wood and the distant, lonely hoot of an owl watching from the edge of a world that is slowly waking up. We are drifting back now, sliding through the layers of time not as scholars or scientists, but as silent observers, ghosts in the smoke, returning to a moment when the earth promised us that the long, brutal winter was finally over. A promise that felt as solid as the ground beneath our feet, though we know now that the ground itself can shift and betray us in the blink of a geological eye. Before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Let me know your city and local time in the comments so we can see where everyone is listening from. We find ourselves standing on the edge of a vast open plain in what we might today call the Northern Hemisphere, perhaps somewhere in Europe or North America, roughly 12,900 years ago, a time when the world feels suspended in a beautiful golden amber of relief, because the great ice sheets, those towering white monsters that had swallowed the continents for thousands of years, are finally retreating, pulling back their frozen claws to reveal a landscape that is raw, wet, and teeming with new life. It feels like a beginning, a permanent shift towards the light, and if you were standing there, feeling the warmth of the sun on your face, a sun that feels stronger and closer than your ancestors ever knew, you would believe with every fiber of your being that the cold was defeated, that the age of ice was a nightmare from which humanity had finally awakened. The air is filled with the sound of water, a constant musical dripping and rushing that serves as the heartbeat of this era, for the glaciers are weeping as they die, sending rivulets of crystal-clear meltwater cascading down into the valleys, feeding rivers that swell and twist like silver veins across the newly exposed land. You can smell the change in the wind, which no longer carries the metallic bite of the eternal frost, but instead bears the sweet, heavy fragrance of blooming sedges and the resinous tang of young birch trees that are marching northward, claiming territory that has been buried under a mile of ice for generations. It is a time of chaotic abundance, where the rules of the old world are dissolving into the mud, and the great herds of bison, horse, and mammoth are drifting through the tall grasses, their heavy coats shedding in patches as they navigate a climate that is becoming surprisingly, deceptively gentle. To the people living here, the bands of hunter-gatherers who watch the seasons turn with a keen and necessary eye, this warming is not just a weather pattern, but a blessing, a sign that the spirits of the sky are pleased, offering a respite that allows families to grow, children to survive their first fragile winters, and the nightly fires to burn a little less desperately. We imagine this change happened suddenly, that the ice vanished overnight, but the truth is slower, quieter, and far more unsettling, for this warming has been creeping in for centuries, a period scientists call the Bölling-Olaruth interstadial, though to the people on the ground, it simply feels like the way the world is supposed to be. There is a sense of permanence to this warmth, a feeling that the earth has settled into a new equilibrium, and as you walk through the tall, wet grass, your boots sinking slightly into the sponge of the tundra, you can feel the vibration of life everywhere, the buzz of insects returning to the air, the splash of waterfowl in the expanding lakes, and the rustle of small mammals scurrying through the underbrush. It is a world in bloom, a false spring on a planetary scale, seducing everything that breathes into a state of vulnerability, encouraging plants to spread their seeds further north, tempting animals to migrate into higher latitudes, and inviting humans to leave the shelter of the deep caves and build lighter, more temporary camps in the open, trusting that the sun will return tomorrow just as warm as it was today. But the memory of the earth is long, and its systems are vast and interconnected in ways that are invisible to the naked eye, hidden beneath the shimmering surface of the oceans and buried deep within the groaning architecture of the remaining ice. While the surface world rejoices in the thaw, deep to the north, beyond the horizon where the white wall still stands tall and stubborn, something is gathering, a quiet accumulation of potential energy that has no malice but possesses terrible power. The great ice sheets of North America, the Laurentide mass that has defined the geography of the continent, are melting, yes, but they are not simply vanishing into vapor. They are transforming into water, colossal volumes of liquid that are pooling in vast silent reservoirs behind dams made of ice and debris, waiting for a moment of weakness. It is easy to forget as we watch the smoke from our campfire drift lazily up toward the stars that water is heavy, that it seeks the lowest point with a relentless patience, and that the stability we feel is largely an illusion held together by temporary barriers. The people of this time do not know that they are living in a pause, a brief inhalation before a scream, for the stories their elders tell are of the ice retreating, of the world getting better, richer, and easier with each passing generation. They have no reason to suspect that the climate is a fragile engine, hummed into rhythm by the movement of heat in the ocean, and that this engine can stall, sputter, and reverse with shocking speed. We see them there, silhouetted against the twilight, perhaps scraping a hide or sharpening a stone point, laughing softly at a joke shared between friends, completely unaware that the ground beneath their feet is essentially a trap door waiting to swing open. The warmth has made them bold, and why shouldn't it? The berries are thick on the bushes, the game is plentiful, and the winters, though still cold, are nothing like the bone-crushing freezes of the deep past. It is a golden age of prehistory, a moment when humanity might have felt for the first time that they had conquered the elements, or at least come to a comfortable truce with them. There is a specific quality to the light in these days, a clarity that comes from an atmosphere washing itself clean of the glacial dust, and as the sun dips below the horizon, painting the sky in bruises of purple and orange, the temperature drops, but it is a manageable chill, a reminder of the night rather than a threat of extinction. The stars emerge one by one, the same constellations we know, but shifted slightly by the wobble of the Earth's axis, looking down on a planet that is greening at the edges, healing from the scars of the ice. Yet, in the silence between the wind gusts, if you listen closely, you might hear the groaning of the glaciers far to the north, a sound like thunder trapped underground, the sound of ice shifting, cracking, and adjusting to the weight of the meltwater pressing against it. It is the sound of a structural failure in slow motion, a warning that is too deep and too low for human ears to register as danger. We drift through this landscape, floating over the herds of reindeer that are grazing peacefully on the lichens, over the small clusters of tents made of skin and wood, over the rivers that are running high and fast, and we feel a profound sense of dramatic irony, a sadness for the hope that permeates this era. We know what is coming. We know that the warmth is a borrowed thing, a loan that the planet is about to recall with interest. The climate system, so complex and delicate, is nearing a tipping point, a threshold where the gentle push of warming will trigger a violent shove of cooling. But for now, in this moment of the narrative, there is no fear. Only the quiet, steady breathing of a world at rest. The fire crackles, popping as a pocket of sap explodes in the heat, sending a tiny spark drifting upward to join the stars, and the storyteller in the shadows pauses, letting the peace of the scene settle into your bones. It is the calm before the storm, but it is more than that. It is a calm that feels eternal, a calm that has convinced every living thing that the struggle is over. The baby sleeping in the furs, the wolf curling its tail around its nose, the owl watching from the branch, they all trust the warmth. And that trust, that beautiful, innocent adaptation to the false spring, is what will make the coming darkness so devastating. The wind shifts slightly, turning from the south to the north, bringing with it a subtle drop in temperature, a tiny shiver that passes through the camp, causing someone to pull their furs tighter, not knowing that this shiver is the first whisper of a ghost returning to reclaim its house. The night deepens, the fire burns low, and the world sleeps, unaware that the water is rising, that the dam is weakening, and that the clock has almost run out. We leave the warmth of the fires now, drifting silently upward like sparks caught in an updraft, floating away from the sleeping faces of the tribes and the gentle rustle of the birch forests, turning our gaze northward toward the source of the wind, where the world changes from green to gray and finally to a blinding, brilliant white. Here, far beyond the hunting grounds, The Earth is still held captive by the Laurentide ice sheet, a colossal monument to the deep past that refuses to die quietly, its surface scarred by millennia of storms and its edges crumbling into a chaotic slush that feeds the very monster that will eventually destroy it. It is a landscape of stark, terrifying beauty, where the horizon is not a line between earth and sky, but a blur of ice fog and pale light, and where the silence is so profound that the cracking of a glacier sounds like the splitting of the sky itself. We are hovering over the heart of North America, roughly where the Canadian province of Manitoba sits today. Though there is no land to be seen here, only a vast, endless expanse of cold water that stretches out to engulf the horizon, a phantom ocean that geologists call Lake Agassiz. It is difficult to comprehend the scale of this body of water as we drift over its glassy, undulating surface, for it is not a lake in the way we understand them now, with cottages on the shore and warm sand beaches. It is a freshwater sea, immense and forbidding, larger at its peak than all of the modern Great Lakes combined, a heavy, dark expanse of meltwater that is pooled in the depression left behind by the crushing weight of the ice. The earth here has been pushed down, bowed by the sheer mass of the glaciers for so long that the crust itself has sagged, creating a gigantic basin that catches every drop of water bleeding off the dying ice sheet. This is the Ghost Lake of the North, a temporary feature of the planet's geography that exists only because the drainage routes to the sea are blocked, sealed shut by the very walls of ice that created the water in the first place. Imagine standing on the edge of this inland sea, the air biting at your exposed skin with a damp, raw chill that seeps through even the thickest furs, looking out at water that is a milky turquoise blue, colored by the rock flour, fine dust ground from the bedrock by the movement of the glaciers, suspended in the depths. There are no waves here, or at least not the rhythmic rolling waves of the ocean, but rather a sluggish, heavy chop driven by the katabatic winds that pour down from the top of the ice sheet, winds that are cold enough to freeze the breath in your throat. The water is lifeless, or nearly so. There are no fish leaping in the twilight, no reeds whispering at the margins, for this is water born of sterile ice, too cold and too new to harbor the complex ecosystems blooming further south. It is a lonely place, a purgatory of water waiting for release. On the northern and eastern rims of this vast lake, the ice sheet itself forms the shoreline, a towering cliff of white and blue that rises hundreds of feet into the air, a dam of unimaginable strength and fragility. It is a strange and unsettling sight, water lapping against a wall of ice, the liquid pressing against the solid, eating away at it, undermining the very barrier that holds it in place. We can hear the groaning of the dam if we drift closer, a deep resonant moaning that vibrates through the water and the air, the sound of the ice adjusting, shifting, resisting the immense pressure of the lake behind it. The water wants to move. It wants to flow to the ocean, to follow gravity down to the North Atlantic, but the path is barred by the ice, forcing the water to rise inch by inch, year by year. It is a slow-motion accumulation of power, a gathering of potential energy that has been building for centuries. Every summer, as the sun beats down on the glacier's surface, rivers of meltwater rush across the top of the ice, carving deep blue canyons before plunging into moulins, vertical shafts that carry the water deep into the belly of the glacier and out into the lake. We watch this process with the detachment of time, seeing the water levels creep up the side of the ice wall, swallowing rocks and ridges that were dry ground only a generation ago. It is a quiet violence, a drowning of the landscape that happens so slowly it would be invisible to a casual observer, yet so relentlessly that nothing can stop it. Sometimes a massive chunk of the ice wall calves off, crashing into the dark water with a roar that echoes for miles, sending a tsunami of displacement rippling across the surface, a sudden, violent reminder of the instability of this system. These icebergs drift aimlessly in the Ghost Lake, white islands in a turquoise sea, slowly melting as they float, carrying rocks and debris that they will eventually drop to the muddy bottom, leaving clues for future scientists to find in the sediment layers. There is a profound sense of tension here, a feeling of holding one's breath. The lake is too full, the dam is too old, The balance is too precarious. Yet, nature is patient, and the physics of the melt continue without pause, indifferent to the consequences. We might imagine a solitary animal, perhaps a lost caribou that has wandered too far north, standing on a rocky outcrop overlooking this endless water, sniffing the air with a confused twitch of its nose, sensing that this place is wrong, that this water does not belong here, that the world is out of order. It turns back, trotting away from the edge, driven by an instinct that understands what we know intellectually, that water always wins. The existence of Lake Agassiz is a testament to the chaotic transition of the planet, a bridge between the frozen stability of the Ice Age and the dynamic fluidity of the future. But right now, it is simply a heavy, silent weight resting on the chest of the continent. The pressure against the ice dam is immense, a physical force that is constantly probing for weaknesses, searching for a crack, a fissure, a soft spot in the frozen armor. Deep beneath the surface, where the ice meets the bedrock, the water is working, lubricating the base of the glacier, lifting it slightly, reducing the friction that holds the massive sheet in place. It is a hidden sabotage, a secret undoing of the dam from the inside out. And still, the surface remains calm, reflecting the gray clouds in the pale sun, a mirror the size of a country, hiding the turbulence that is building below. We drift along the perimeter, tracing the shoreline that historians and geologists still debate, trying to map exactly where the water stood at its highest point, looking for the ancient beaches that are now stranded high on dry land, miles from any modern water. These strand lines are the only memory the land has of this time, faint ridges of gravel and sand that mark the pause of the ghost lake before its inevitable demise. But in this moment, the lake is real, it is heavy, and it is waiting. The sun dips lower, casting long shadows from the ice cliffs across the water, turning the turquoise to a deep bruised indigo. The temperature plummets, and a thin skin of new ice begins to form at the edges of the lake, a fragile crust that will melt again with the morning sun. It is a cycle of freezing and thawing, of holding and releasing, but the overall trend is clear. The water is rising. The reservoir is filling. The ghost is growing stronger. We feel a deep empathy for the ice, this ancient giant that is being besieged by its own offspring, the meltwater. It is a tragic relationship, the parent destroyed by the child, the solid destroyed by the liquid. The ice sheet is old, tired, and retreating, while the lake is young, growing, and restless. It is a confrontation between the past and the future, played out in the silence of the north. As the twilight deepens into the true dark of the prehistoric night, the aurora borealis begins to dance overhead, green and purple ribbons unfurling across the sky, reflected perfectly in the still black mirror of Lake Agassiz. It is a scene of breathtaking serenity, a cosmic light show playing to an empty theater, witnessed only by the ice, the water, and the silent drifting ghosts of our own curiosity. But the beauty is deceptive. Underneath the shimmering lights, the pressure continues to build. The water presses, the ice groans, and the world turns, unaware that the dam is reaching its breaking point, unaware that the ghost lake is about to become a very real, very physical force that will change history. The silence here is not peace. It is the holding of a breath before a scream. The break does not begin with a roar, but with a sound far more unsettling, a sharp, singular crack that rings out across the frozen silence like the snapping of a titan's spine, a noise so loud and so sudden that it seems to sever the very air itself, causing the few birds circling the gray sky to scatter in panic. It is the sound of physics finally winning the argument against structure, the sound of the critical threshold being crossed, and for a heartbeat, just one single, suspended heartbeat, the world holds still, as if paralyzed by the realization of what has just happened. Then, the white wall of the ice dam, that towering fortress which has held the Ghost Lake prisoner for so long, begins to move, not sliding or shifting as glaciers do, but crumbling, disintegrating from the inside out as the immense pressure of the water finds the fatal flaw it has been seeking for centuries. A fissure races up the face of the ice like a bolt of jagged lightning frozen in place, And then, with a groan that drops an octave until it becomes a vibration felt in the teeth and the bones, the dam collapses. It is not a slow leak, not a gradual erosion. It is a catastrophic failure, a bursting of the floodgates on a biblical scale, and in an instant, the stored energy of Lake Agassiz is converted into kinetic violence. Millions of cubic meters of ice, some chunks the size of cathedrals, are hurled aside as if they were pebbles, tossed into the churning white chaos that erupts from the breach. The water, released from its purgatory, does not flow. It explodes, a liquid sledgehammer punching through the landscape with a force that defies comprehension, driven by the weight of a sea trying to fit through a canyon. The roar is no longer a sound. It is a physical presence, a wall of noise that obliterates all other senses, a deafening, continuous thunder that shakes the bedrock miles away. We watch, terrified and awed, as the freshwater pulse surges forward, a brown and white avalanche of water, ice, rock, and mud, tearing through the valley, stripping the soil down to the bare ancient stone in seconds, erasing forests as if they were made of matchsticks. Trees that have stood for decades are snapped, uprooted, and pulverized in the blink of an eye, becoming part of the battering ram that widens the wound in the earth. The flood is moving with such speed and volume that it creates its own weather, generating wind and mist that obscure the sun, turning the day into a churning gray twilight. It is a river the size of an ocean, a mega flood that makes modern river floods look like spilled cups of tea. The water is cold, freezing cold, darker than the ice from which it came, and it carries the scent of pulverized stone and ancient dust, a smell of raw, broken earth. As the torrent races toward the sea, it carves new landscapes in real time, digging coulees and scablands that will remain as scars on the face of the continent for thousands of years, dry waterfalls that will one day baffle and amaze the humans who stumble upon them. Scientists still debate exactly which path the water took, whether it burst north down the Mackenzie Valley to the Arctic Ocean or east through the St. Lawrence to the Atlantic, or perhaps both in a chaotic multi-front war against the land. But the result is the same. The freshwater is leaving the continent, fleeing the trap of the interior. The ground trembles under the assault, a localized earthquake caused not by tectonic plates, but by the sheer mass of the moving water, a rumble that travels through the soles of the feet of animals grazing miles away, causing heads to lift and ears to swivel in confusion. They cannot know what this sound is, for nothing in their genetic memory has prepared them for a flood of this magnitude. It is a freak event, a rare convulsion of the deglaciation process, a moment when the gradual tick-tock of geological time is interrupted by a sudden, violent cymbal crash. The floodwater is not just water. It is a chaotic suspension of ice blocks and sediment, a grinding slurry that acts like sandpaper on the valleys it scours. We see massive icebergs, liberated from the lake, bobbing and spinning in the violent current, smashing into canyon walls, shattering into millions of glittering shards that are swallowed by the foam. The sheer scale of the displacement is staggering. It is estimated that the volume of water released in this event was enough to raise global sea levels by several meters, not over centuries, but perhaps in a matter of months or even weeks. It is a planetary transfer of mass, a shifting of weight from the land to the ocean that is so significant it slightly alters the rotation of the Earth. As we follow the leading edge of this deluge, we see the destruction of the false spring in microcosm. The delicate new ecosystems that had begun to form in the valleys are wiped clean, reset to zero, buried under feet of mud and ice. It is a merciless cleaning, a reminder that the land does not belong to the plants or the animals, but to the forces that shape it. The noise begins to fade only because we are moving faster than the sound, drifting ahead of the wavefront, watching the unsuspecting riverbeds swell and burst as the pulse approaches. The existing rivers are overwhelmed, their banks obliterated, their courses straightened by the brute force of the incoming flood. It is a chaotic, messy, terrifying liberation. The water is desperate to reach the ocean, to find the level, to mix with the salt, and nothing will stand in its way. We can imagine the mist rising from the churning water, a cold fog that blankets the devastation, hiding the wreckage of the forest and the scattered bodies of animals caught in the surge. There is no time for mourning here, no time for processing the loss. There is only the forward momentum of the water. The event feels incredibly modern in its violence, like disaster footage from a newsreel, yet it is ancient, happening in a world without cameras, without witnesses, without a name. It is simply the earth adjusting itself, finding a new posture, and doing so with a shudder that creates a catastrophe. The flood rushes on day after day, a relentless conveyor belt of fresh water, dumping the contents of the ghost lake into the world's oceans. The lake level drops, leaving high water marks stranded on the hillsides, ghostly rings around the basin that mark where the water used to be. The pressure on the remaining ice sheet eases, but the damage is done. The genie is out of the bottle. The fresh water, billions of tons of it, is no longer contained. It is free, and it is heading for the one place where it can do the most damage to the global climate, the sensitive, salty, sinking engines of the North Atlantic. The roar of the flood continues, a background radiation of sound that permeates the landscape. But as the initial surge passes, the violence settles into a steady, grim pouring. The wound in the ice remains open, a gaping mouth vomiting water into the sea. We watch the plume of fresh, muddy water hit the ocean, a distinct pale tongue licking out into the dark blue of the Atlantic, refusing to mix at first, floating on top like oil on water. This is the moment of contact, the moment the terrestrial catastrophe becomes a climatic one. The land has been scoured, the lake has been drained, and now the ocean must deal with the consequences. The physical violence of the flood is ending, but the chemical violence, the invisible disruption of density and salt, is just beginning. The crash of the water hitting the sea sends spray high into the air, tasting of iron and dirt, a stark contrast to the clean salt spray of the ocean. The two worlds collide, the frozen fresh water of the past and the warm salt water of the present, and in their meeting, they begin a reaction that will turn back the clock. The sun sets over a churning brown ocean, the water stained by the blood of the continent, and the waves that break against the shore tonight are heavy, different, carrying the weight of a lake that has died to be here. The sound of the breaking dam echoes in our memory, a phantom crack that marks the exact second the world changed course. We follow the ghost water as it bleeds into the vast heaving chest of the North Atlantic, drifting away from the violent, muddy scar on the coastline and moving out into the deep open ocean where the sky meets the water in a seamless horizon of steel gray. It is here, far from the crashing noise of the dam collapse, that the true catastrophe begins, not with a roar, but with a terrifying silence, a stillness that spreads through the veins of the world like a slow-acting poison. We are hovering over the surface of the sea, bobbing on the swells that roll relentlessly from the west. And to the naked eye, nothing seems wrong. The waves still break, the wind still blows, and the gulls still cry out in the emptiness. But if we could see with the eyes of the ocean itself, if we could taste the chemistry of the water, we would sense a profound and deadly confusion taking hold. The Atlantic is not merely a basin of water. It is a global engine, a colossal liquid conveyor belt that has been humming steadily for thousands of years, pumping heat from the sweltering tropics up toward the shivering north, keeping the lands of Europe and North America warm and habitable. This engine, which scientists call the Atlantic Meridional Overturning Circulation, or AMOC, relies on a delicate, invisible balance of salt and temperature, a recipe as precise as any alchemist's potion. Under normal skies, the warm, salty water of the Gulf Stream flows northward, carrying the stored heat of the Caribbean sun like a gift to the high latitudes. And as it reaches the cold winds near Greenland and Iceland, it surrenders that heat to the atmosphere, warming the air. As the water cools, it contracts, becoming denser, and because the salt has been concentrated by evaporation on its long journey north, it becomes heavy, so heavy that it can no longer float. In a majestic, silent waterfall that happens entirely underwater, billions of tons of this cold, salty water sink into the abyss, plunging miles down to the ocean floor to begin the long journey back south, pulling more warm water up behind it to take its place. It is the heartbeat of the Northern Hemisphere, a rhythmic driving pulse that circulates warmth and life. But now, the pulse is skipping a beat. The flood from the Ghost Lake has arrived, and it is a massive, buoyant blanket of fresh water that refuses to sink. Fresh water is lighter than salt water, less dense, and as it spreads across the surface of the North Atlantic, it creates a lid, a barrier that seals off the ocean from the atmosphere. The warm water from the south still arrives, expecting to cool and sink, but it finds itself trapped beneath this layer of fresh, cold meltwater, unable to mix, unable to become heavy enough to plunge into the depths. The mechanics of the conveyor belt are broken. The sinking sites in the Labrador Sea and the Nordic Seas, the very pistons of the engine, are being flooded with water that is too light to fall. We watch in the eerie silence of the deep as the great vertical currents, the chimneys of the ocean where water usually crashes down to the bottom, begin to falter and fade. The downward flow slows to a trickle, and then, in some places, it stops altogether. The connection between the surface and the deep is severed. It is a moment of planetary cardiac arrest. The heat that was destined for the north has nowhere to go. The conveyor belt jams and the warmth begins to pile up in the south or dissipate uselessly into the atmosphere, leaving the north stranded, cut off from its supply of thermal energy. It is strange to think that such a massive change can happen without a single visible sign on the surface. A sailor crossing the Atlantic in a hypothetical boat would see only waves and weather, unaware that beneath the keel, the fundamental circulation of the planet is dying. The ocean currents are the memory of the climate, carrying the heat of yesteryear to the air of today. But now that memory is being wiped clean. The water grows stiller, colder, and more stratified. The heat that kept the glaciers at bay, that encouraged the birch forests to march north, that allowed the hunter-gatherers to sleep under the stars, that heat is being turned off at the source. It seems almost impossible that water, simply by being fresh instead of salty, could wield such power. Yet this density difference is the lever upon which the fate of continents rests. Scientists still debate the exact sensitivity of this system, arguing over just how much fresh water is required to trigger a collapse. Some say it takes a massive catastrophic pulse, while others suggest the ocean is bistable, capable of flipping between on and off states with surprisingly little provocation. But in our story, the threshold has clearly been crossed. The Atlantic is shutting down. The feedback loops begin to spin in reverse. As the northward flow of warm water weakens, the northern seas become even colder, which leads to more sea ice forming. This new ice, bright and white, reflects the weak sunlight back into space, cooling the region further and preventing even more heat from being absorbed by the ocean, a vicious cycle of cooling begetting cooling. The ocean, which had been the great moderator, the gentle buffer that softened the edges of the winter, has now turned its back on the land. We feel the shift in the air above the water. The wind that blows off the Atlantic is no longer carrying the scent of the Gulf Stream's warmth. It is becoming sharp, biting, and dry. The humidity drops. The evaporation slows. The massive heat transfer that defines the climate of the Holocene is being dismantled, gear by gear, current by current. Deep below, in the abyssal plains where the sun never shines, the creatures of the dark wait for the oxygen-rich water that usually sinks from the surface, but the supply is being choked off. The stillness spreads downwards, a creeping stagnation that mirrors the freezing above. It is a loneliness of the deep, a quieting of the chaotic energy that drives the biosphere. We drift north towards the coast of Europe, moving with the wind, and we can sense the absence of the warmth that should be there. The radiator of the North Atlantic has gone cold. The heat is gone. The physics of buoyancy have dictated a new reality, one where the equator keeps its heat, and the poles are left to their own frozen devices. It is a return to a more primitive, separated state of the climate, a divorce between the north and the south. As we hover over the gray waves, we feel a sense of foreboding for the land that lies ahead, for the innocent green world we left behind in the first section. The land does not know yet. The trees are still standing, the animals are still grazing, the people are still tending their fires, trusting in the coming spring. They do not feel the conveyor belt slowing down thousands of miles away. They do not know that the ocean has stopped breathing. The delay between the oceanic cause and the atmospheric effect is the most dangerous time, the phony war where peace seems to reign while the invasion force gathers at the border. The energy balance of the planet has shifted, tipping violently away from warmth, and the atmosphere, which is a slave to the ocean's whims, is about to catch up. The sky begins to darken, not with storm clouds, but with a heaviness that speaks of a fundamental loss of energy. The wind picks up, whistling over the wave tops, sounding like a lament for the lost current. The Atlantic, that vast, moody, powerful character in our history, has changed its mind. It has decided to be cold, and as the last vestiges of the warm pulse fade into the surrounding chill, swallowed by the indifference of the physics, we realize that the door to the ice age, which we thought was locked and barred, has been left wide open. The draft is already coming through, invisible and silent, creeping across the water, heading for the shore. The false spring is over, not because of a change in the sun or a shift in the orbit, but because the ocean has forgotten how to sink. The heartbeat has stopped, and now we wait for the body of the world to go cold. The news travels first by the wind, an invisible messenger sweeping in from the west, carrying the chill of the dying ocean across the shoreline and deep into the heart of the continents, moving through the forests and the valleys like a ghost searching for a place to rest. It arrives not with the crash of thunder or the violence of a storm, but with a quiet, insidious persistence, a drop in the temperature that defies the calendar and ignores the position of the sun. We are back on the land now, standing at the edge of the birch forests that had been so boldly marching north, and we can feel the change in the texture of the air, which has lost its softness, its humidity, and its promise of life. The wind feels thin, sharp, and dry, stripping the moisture from the leaves and the skin, leaving behind a sensation of brittleness, as if the world is slowly turning into glass. The false spring does not end with a handshake. It ends with a betrayal. The winter comes, as it always does. But this year, when the time for the thaw arrives, when the days grow longer and the light returns, the cold refuses to leave. It hangs on, stubborn and heavy, an unwanted guest that has settled into the bones of the landscape. The snow that fell in December does not melt in April. Instead, it hardens, forming a crust of ice that reflects the weak sunlight back into a sky that seems to have grown more distant, a pale, washed-out blue that offers no warmth. To the people and the animals living through this shift, it is a time of profound confusion, a breaking of the covenant between the earth and the sky. We watch a family of hunter-gatherers emerging from their winter shelter, squinting against the glare of the snow, waiting for the smell of mud and rain that signals the beginning of the hunting season. But the smell never comes. The wind remains in the north, locking the land in a grip of iron. They look at the budding trees, which had started to open in a premature optimism, and watch as the frost blackens the young green shoots, killing the hope of the forest in a single, silent night. It is a slow-motion disaster, a famine of warmth that spreads from the ground up. The soil, which had been thawing and breathing for centuries, begins to freeze again, the frost penetrating deeper and deeper, inch by inch, reclaiming the earth for the permafrost. We can hear, in the dead of night, the startling gunshot cracks of the trees exploding, their sap freezing and expanding until the wood can no longer contain the pressure, a sound that echoes through the starving forest like a signal of surrender. The radiator of the Atlantic has been turned off, and without that steady stream of heat, the continents of the Northern Hemisphere are losing their ability to retain energy. The temperature plummets, not by a degree or two, but by a staggering amount. Evidence from ice cores in Greenland suggests that in some places, the average temperature fell by as much as 10 degrees Celsius or 18 degrees Fahrenheit in the span of a human lifetime, perhaps even less. It is a climate whiplash, a sudden return to the glacial baseline that feels violent in its speed. Imagine the shock of a world that was preparing for summer suddenly plunged back into the depths of a prehistoric winter. The rivers, which had been rushing with meltwater, begin to choke with ice again, their flow slowing, their surfaces sealing over with thick, opaque lids. The lakes, once teeming with waterfowl, fall silent as the ice creeps inward from the shores, closing the open water like a shrinking pupil. It is a world losing its color, fading from the vibrant greens and browns of the interstadial back to the monochromatic palette of the Ice Age. White snow, gray ice, black rock. The animals are the first to suffer the consequences of this thermal collapse. We see the herds of elk and red deer, creatures adapted to the woodlands and the softer climate, standing huddled together in the driving snow, their breath rising in thick clouds of steam, their coats insufficient against a cold they were not born to endure. They scrape at the ground with their hooves, searching for the grass that is buried under layers of hard-packed drift. But they find only ice. The logic of their migration routes, passed down through generations, has been broken. The pastures they seek are gone, replaced by a wind-scoured wasteland. It is a heartbreaking sight, the confusion of biology in the face of geology, the struggle of life against a planet that has changed its mind. The predators, the wolves, and the few remaining great cats fare little better, for while the cold does not kill them directly, the scarcity of prey and the difficulty of movement in the deep snow saps their strength. The balance of the ecosystem is tilting wildly, sliding toward a harsh simplicity where only the toughest, the most cold-adapted, will survive. Scientists still debate the exact speed of this transition, whether it happened over a few decades, or, as some terrifyingly precise data suggests, in a handful of years, perhaps as few as 3 to 5. But for the living things on the ground, the academic distinction is meaningless. It happened fast enough to feel like a punishment. 1 year the strawberries bloomed. A few years later, the ground was hard as stone. We drift through this freezing world, moving across landscapes that are being swiftly terraformed by the temperature. The humidity in the atmosphere drops precipitously because the cold ocean is no longer evaporating water to form clouds, and so the air becomes clear, dry, and brutally cold, allowing the heat of the day to escape instantly into space the moment the sun sets. The nights become long, terrifying ordeals of endurance. We see the humans, those adaptable survivors, digging in, retreating to the mouths of caves or constructing semi-subterranean dwellings, trying to use the earth itself as insulation against the biting wind. Their world has shrunk. The vast open plains where they roamed freely are now hostile zones of exposure. The stories told around the fires change. They no longer speak of the expanding world, but of the great cold that stole the sun, of the spirits who were angry, of the need to appease the winter. There is a heaviness in the camp, a quiet despair as the firewood supplies dwindle and the game becomes scarce. It is a psychological return to the Ice Age as much as a physical one. The horizon, once a beckoning line of possibility, is now a threat. The clouds that do form are different now, thin, high wisps of ice crystals that hallow the moon, signaling more cold, more wind. Dust begins to rise from the drying plains, whipped up by the intensifying winds, creating a haze that dims the sun even at noon, a sepia-toned filter over the dying landscape. This is the beginning of the Younger Dryas, a name that sounds academic to us, but to them it is simply the end of the good times. It is the realization that the warmth was a temporary anomaly, a dream from which they have been rudely awakened. The cold is not just a weather event, it is a presence, a weight that presses down on everything. It slows the movement of the water, the growth of the plants, the beat of the heart. As we watch the snow begin to pile up against the trunks of the dead trees, covering the scars of the landscape in a shroud of white, we feel the profound indifference of the earth. It does not care that the deer are hungry or that the people are cold. It is simply following the laws of thermodynamics, balancing the energy equation that was upset by the flood. The pendulum has swung back, and it has swung hard. The warmth is a memory, fading as quickly as the last embers of a dying fire, and in its place, The silence of the frost settles over the world, absolute and commanding. It is a silence that demands respect, a silence that says, "Sleep now. The time for growing is over." And so the land obeys, freezing into a stillness that will last for 1,000 years. We lower our gaze now, drifting down from the gray, wind-scoured sky to the very surface of the earth, kneeling in the dirt to witness an invasion that happens not with the roar of water or the crash of ice, but with the silent, creeping persistence of a root system. As the forests of the false spring wither and die, their skeletons bleaching in the dry cold, the ground they leave behind does not remain bare for long, for nature abhors a vacuum, even one created by a freezing catastrophe. In the spaces between the rocks, in the thin, gravelly soil where the grand oaks and the hopeful pines can no longer find purchase, a new conqueror begins to spread, though it is so small, so humble, and so quiet that you might step on it without ever knowing you are crushing the namesake of the entire era. It is a low-growing, mat-forming subshrub, a tough little survivor known to botany as Dryas octopetala, or the mountain avens, and its sudden explosive dominance across the Northern Hemisphere is the signature of this time, the biological fingerprint that will one day tell the story of the cold return. Imagine a plant built for adversity, a creature of the wind and the frost, with small oak-shaped leaves that are leathery and tough, scalloped along the edges like tiny green saw blades. These leaves are not the soft, lush foliage of the warm times. They are armored, designed to hoard moisture in a drying world, their undersides covered in a dense white felt of hairs that trap dead air and protect the plant from the biting chill of the permafrost beneath. It is a masterpiece of evolutionary engineering, a plant that looks at the freezing wind and simply hunkers down, hugging the earth, creating its own microclimate in the few inches of relatively still air right above the soil. As the climate crashes, this plant does not retreat, it advances. It moves south, flowing like a slow green glacier down from the high Arctic and down from the mountain peaks, claiming the lowlands of Europe and North America that were, just a few decades ago, warm enough for beetles and butterflies. It is a silent colonization, a reclaiming of the continent by the flora of the tundra. In the short, bright burst of the summer, for the sun still shines, even in the cold, the Dryas unfurls its flowers, and they are unexpectedly beautiful, solitary blooms with 8 creamy white petals surrounding a center of golden stamens, looking like little suns scattered across the gray rocky landscape. They have a peculiar, charming habit of tracking the sun across the sky, twisting their stems to keep their open faces pointed toward the light, a behavior known as heliotropism, which concentrates the solar heat onto the center of the flower, creating a warm, inviting cup that attracts the few shivering pollinators left in this harsh world. There is something profoundly moving about seeing these millions of tiny white flowers nodding in the wind, a vast, shivering carpet of life that has thrived precisely because the world has become difficult. They are the weeds of the winter, the opportunists of the ice. To the human eye, the spread of the Dryas might look like a meadow, but it is a specific kind of meadow, a mammoth steppe, dry, cold, and open, offering no shelter from the horizon. The presence of this flower changes the color of the land. Where there was once the vertical complexity of brush and saplings, there is now the horizontal simplicity of the tundra, a landscape of low friction where the wind can build up speed over hundreds of miles without hitting a single obstacle. We watch the seasons turn, and when the short summer ends, the white petals fall away, replaced by seed heads that look like feathery twisting plumes of silver silk. These seeds are designed to fly, to catch the relentless winds of the Younger Dryas and travel for miles before finding a new crack in the rock to call home. It is a dispersal mechanism perfectly suited to a windy, open planet. But the true legacy of the Dryas octopetala is not just in its survival, but in what it leaves behind. Every year, as the flowers bloom and die, they release clouds of microscopic pollen into the air, a golden dust that is invisible to the naked eye but heavy with history. This pollen drifts on the breeze, swirling over the landscape, and eventually settles on the surfaces of the lakes and bogs that have not yet frozen solid. Slowly, silently, the pollen grains sink through the dark water, landing on the muddy bottom, layer upon layer, year after year, century after century. They are burying themselves in the archive of the earth, creating a physical record of the atmosphere. It is these layers of mud that will, thousands of years later, allow scientists to unlock the secret of this time. When they drill into the lake beds and pull up the long cylindrical cores of sediment, they will find a distinct band of mud where the pollen of the trees, the pine, the birch, the oak, suddenly vanishes, replaced almost entirely by the pollen of this single stubborn Arctic flower. It is this abundance, this sudden spike in the pollen count of Dryas octopetala, that gives the Younger Dryas its name. It is a period defined by a flower, a time when the delicate white petal became the symbol of a planet in reverse. We drift over this carpet of mountain avens, feeling the crunch of the frost-hardened ground, and we realize that the dominance of this plant is a signal that the ecosystem has fundamentally shifted gears. The complex, vertical, multi-layered world of the forest has collapsed into the simple, two-dimensional resilience of the tundra. It is a harsh beauty, a minimalist landscape where life clings to the surface tension of the rock. The flower is not a villain in this story. It is a healer, a stabilizer, holding the soil together against the erosion of the wind, preparing the ground for the distant future when the warmth might return. But for now, it reigns supreme. It covers the hills of Ireland, the plains of Germany, the valleys of Scandinavia. It creeps around the edges of the campfire sites where humans huddle, a reminder that the wild is closing in. There's a quiet dignity to the Dryas, a refusal to give up just because the sun has lost its strength. It teaches us that life does not always need comfort to flourish. Sometimes it only needs an opening. As the wind ripples through the silver seed heads, creating waves that look like a dry, gray ocean, we feel the immense scale of this botanical takeover. The forests are gone, banished to the far south, hiding in the refuges of the Mediterranean and the Caucasus, waiting for a signal that will not come for 1,000 years. In their place, the Dryas flower holds the line, a tiny, tough sentinel of the cold, watching the sky with its golden eye, waiting, enduring, and writing its name into the mud of history with every grain of pollen it sheds. The world has become a garden of ice, and this is its only rose. We drift upward now, rising from the carpet of white flowers to hover among the gray skeletal fingers of the giants that are slowly losing their grip on the world, witnessing the silent, agonizing retreat of the ancient forests that had, only a moment ago in geological time, promised to cover the continents in a blanket of eternal green. It is a scene of majestic melancholy, a slow-motion evacuation of life from the latitudes that are no longer welcoming. And as we move through the ghostly stands of pine and birch, we can feel the profound stillness of an ecosystem that has stopped breathing. The trees do not pick up their roots and walk south. They simply stop growing, their sap slowing to a sluggish crawl, their buds failing to open when the weak sun returns, until finally they stand as monuments to a climate that no longer exists. We are watching the death of the green wall that had been marching toward the Arctic, a reversal of the great colonization that defined the false spring. The air here is filled with the sound of dry wood groaning, a mournful creaking that rises whenever the wind gusts through the branches, rubbing the dead limbs against one another like the strings of an out-of-tune cello. There is no softness left here, no canopy of leaves to dampen the sound or catch the rain. There's only the stark architectural geometry of bare trunks against a pale sky. The first to go are the broad-leaved trees, the oaks and the hazels that had ventured too far north, seduced by the warmth. They die quickly, shocked by the sudden return of the deep frost, their vascular systems bursting as the water inside them turns to ice. But the conifers, the tough pines and spruces, fight a longer, more desperate battle. We see them standing on the ridges, their needles turning a rusty, brittle orange, falling in showers that coat the snow in a layer of dead copper. They are starving, not for lack of soil, but for lack of liquid water and warmth. The permafrost is rising from below, a layer of permanently frozen earth that creeps upward year by year, choking the deep roots, cutting off the connection to the groundwater, turning the soil into a block of concrete that the roots cannot penetrate. The trees are being strangled from the bottom up and desiccated from the top down. It is a physiological drought, a cruel paradox where the tree is surrounded by water in the form of ice, yet dies of thirst because it cannot drink a solid. The wind, stripped of its moisture by the freezing ocean, acts like a rasp, scouring the bark, stripping away the protective layers, polishing the dead wood until it shines like bone. We drift past these ghost forests, whole valleys filled with standing dead timber, a silent army that has succumbed to the cold. In some places, the trees are not dead yet, but they are changed, twisted by the wind and the weight of the snow into strange, stunted shapes known as krummholz, or crooked wood, growing horizontally along the ground in a desperate attempt to stay below the biting wind, looking more like bushes than the proud sentinels they once were. It is a humiliation of the forest, a forcing of the vertical world into the horizontal. The retreat is patchy, chaotic. Scientists analyzing ancient pollen diagrams often describe a mosaic landscape, where pockets of hardy spruce might cling to a sheltered valley floor while the surrounding hills are swept clean. But the overall trend is undeniable. The tree line is falling back, retreating hundreds of miles to the south, fleeing the ice sheet's expanding influence. We watch the shadows of the dead trees lengthen in the afternoon light, stretching across the snow like the bars of a cage, and we realize that the loss of the forest is not just a botanical event. It is a loss of shelter. The forest was a home, a windbreak, a roof. Without it, the land is exposed, naked to the sky. The wind, finding no obstacles, begins to accelerate, building up speed across the open plains, driving the snow into hard, sculpted dunes that look like waves on a frozen ocean. The acoustic landscape changes entirely. Gone is the hushed, cathedral-like intimacy of the woods, replaced by the vast, rushing roar of the open steppe, a sound that makes you feel small and unprotected. In the peat bogs of northern Europe, we can sometimes find the physical evidence of this great dying even today. Layers of preserved pine stumps, their roots spread flat because they could not dig down into the frozen earth, buried under meters of later growth, a subterranean graveyard of the Younger Dryas. It feels disrespectful to move too quickly through these graveyards, so we linger, watching the bark peel away in long, paper-thin strips from the white birches, fluttering in the breeze like flags of surrender. The smell of the forest, that rich, damp scent of humus and decay, is gone, replaced by the sterile, metallic scent of ozone and ice. The decomposition stops. The dead trees do not rot, for it is too cold for the bacteria to do their work. They simply stand there, preserved in the freezer of the world, seasoning slowly in the dry air. It is a suspended state of entropy. We might see a solitary bird, perhaps a ptarmigan, perched on a dead branch, its white plumage blending perfectly with the snow, a creature that belongs to this new, open world, watching the forest die with an indifferent eye. The bird knows what the trees do not, that this is the time of the open country, the time of the grass and the sedge. The forest is a memory of a warmer time, an anomaly that is being corrected. As the trees fall, one by one, pushed over by the relentless wind or the weight of the snow, they are slowly buried, disappearing into the expanding tundra. The horizon opens up, widening, stretching out until the earth seems to curve visibly away from you. This opening of the landscape has profound consequences for everything that walks or crawls. There is nowhere to hide anymore. The predators can see for miles. The prey can run for miles. The intimate hide-and-seek game of the woodland hunt is replaced by the long-distance endurance logic of the steppe. The removal of the trees also changes the light. Without the filtering canopy, the sun reflects off the snow with a blinding intensity, a hard white glare that sears the eyes. It is a high-contrast world, black dead wood against white living snow, devoid of the soft dappled shadows of the past. We feel a deep sense of loss for the canopy, for the feeling of being held by the branches, for the indoor feeling of the deep woods. Now we are strictly outdoors. The sky is too big, the wind is too loud, the earth is too hard. We drift south, following the retreating edge of the tree line, watching the green wall crumble and fade, leaving behind a landscape that has been scrubbed clean, prepared for a new kind of existence. The transition is slow, taking generations of trees to fully play out, but in the memory of the Earth, it is a sudden deforestation, a stripping away of the planet's fur. The ancient forests have gone to sleep, retreating to the refugia of the south, waiting for the signal to return, a signal that is currently drowned out by the howling of the wind. And as the last standing trunk in the valley finally gives way, cracking at the base and toppling into the snow with a soft, muffled thud, we are left with the silence of the plains, a silence that is vast, empty, and terrifyingly open. We lower our perspective now, sinking down from the sweeping, impersonal height of the retreating tree line to the intimate, rhythmic level of the shoulder and the hoof, joining the great shaggy processions that are moving slowly across the hardening face of the earth. Here, in the midst of the vast open steppe, the confusion is not an intellectual concept, but a physical ache, a gnawing hollowness in the belly, and a bewilderment that sits heavy in the dark, liquid eyes of the beasts. We are drifting alongside the herds of steppe bison, wild horses, and the magnificent doomed giant Irish elk, creatures who are the true citizens of this landscape, guided not by maps, but by a deep ancestral memory encoded in their blood. For thousands of generations, their mothers and grandmothers have taught them the rhythm of the year, move north when the days lengthen to find the sweet new grass of the meltwater valleys, and move south when the days shorten to escape the worst of the dark. It was a contract with the world that had held true for the entirety of the false spring, a reliable cycle of risk and reward. But now, the contract has been broken, torn up by the invisible hands of the ocean and the wind. We watch a massive herd of bison plodding forward, their heads low, swinging rhythmically from side to side to sweep away the snow, their breath forming a continuous low-hanging fog bank that moves with them. They are marching north, following the ancient impulse, but the north has closed its doors. The pastures they remember, the lush, wet sedge meadows that should be waiting for them, are gone, buried under sheets of wind-packed ice or replaced by the dry, unpalatable crunch of the Dryas flowers, the nutritious herbs, the broad-leafed forbs that provided the calcium and protein needed to grow big bones and produce rich milk, have withered away, replaced by tough, fibrous grasses that fill the stomach but starve the body. It is a trophic mismatch, a fatal timing error where the animals arrive for a banquet that was canceled weeks ago. We can hear the clicking of their ankle bones, a dry, percussive sound in the muffled silence of the snow, and the low, grunting communications that pass between them, sounds of reassurance that seem to hang unanswered in the freezing air. The confusion is palpable. The matriarchs, the old females who lead the herds, stop frequently, lifting their heavy heads to sniff the wind, searching for a scent of water or thaw that isn't there. They turn in circles, their instincts warring with their senses, the magnetic pull of migration fighting against the immediate reality of the cold. It is a crisis of navigation. The landmarks they used to know, the shape of a forest edge, the line of a river, have been erased or altered by the snow and the dying trees. The world is becoming a white room, devoid of features, and in this sensory deprivation, the herds crowd closer together, seeking the only comfort left, the heat of another living body. We drift towards a solitary figure standing slightly apart from the flow, a giant Irish elk, Megalochirus gigantus, a creature so majestic it looks like a myth that has wandered into reality. He stands over 2 meters tall at the shoulder, but it is his antlers that stop the breath, a colossal span of bone stretching 12 feet across, weighing nearly 90 pounds, a crown of immense biological cost. In the rich days of the warm period, these antlers were a sign of health, a sexual signal fueled by the abundance of mineral-rich plants. But in the Younger Dryas, they are a burden, a tragic liability. We watch him lower his head to graze, the massive weight pulling him down, his neck muscles straining against the leverage. He scrapes at the frozen ground, finding only meager, silica-rich grass that wears down his teeth and offers little sustenance. To grow these antlers again next spring, he needs calcium and phosphorus in quantities the landscape can no longer provide. He is a king in a kingdom that has run out of gold. Scientists have long debated whether it was the climate or human hunters that finally drove these giants to extinction. But here, in the quiet of the snowfall, it seems clear that the cold itself is the primary antagonist. The energy required to stay warm, to move through the deep drifts, and to carry that magnificent rack is simply too great for the calories available. He lifts his head, snow-dusting his velvet nose, and looks toward the horizon with a gaze that feels ancient and weary, a creature designed for a world that has vanished beneath his feet. He is overdressed for the party, a masterpiece of evolution stranded in a minimalist age. Further afield, the small, sturdy wild horses, the ancestors of the Przewalski's horse, fare slightly better, their smaller bodies and rock-hard hooves better adapted to scraping through the ice, but even they are thin, their ribs showing through their shaggy winter coats. They stand with their tails to the wind, heads lowered in a state of torpor, conserving every ounce of energy, waiting for a sunrise that brings heat. The foals, born into this new, harsh reality, do not know that the world was ever different. They frolic for a moment in the snow, a brief spark of playfulness that earns a gentle reprimanding nudge from a mother who knows that energy is life. There is a profound silence to their suffering. Nature does not complain. The herds simply endure, moving, searching, thinning out as the weakest fall behind to become food for the wolves and the silence. The landscape is littered with the invisible barriers of the cold. A river that was once a crossing point is now a treacherous expanse of unstable ice. A valley that offered shelter is now a wind tunnel. The mental maps are being rewritten in real time, often with fatal consequences. We feel a deep empathy for this confusion, for the betrayal of the biology. It is as if the rules of the game were changed in the middle of the match. The blue-gray landscape of the mammoth steppe is expanding, and while the woolly mammoths are perhaps the best equipped to handle it, returning to their element with a certain lumbering grace, even they face the challenge of deep snow, which can trap a calf or exhaust an adult. We see a line of them in the distance, gray mountains moving against a white sky, their curved tusks sweeping the snow aside like plows, creating a path for the smaller animals to follow. A momentary, accidental act of interspecies cooperation in the face of the freeze. But for the most part, the herds are isolated in their struggle. The biodiversity is dropping. The specialized feeders, the animals that needed specific plants, are quietly disappearing, leaving only the generalists, the survivors who can eat anything and endure everything. The rich tapestry of the Pleistocene fauna is unraveling, thread by thread. The noise of the landscape has changed too. The diverse chorus of calls from the warm period has been replaced by the singular hollow sound of the wind and the crunch of hooves. It is a lonelier world. The herds move on, drifting like smoke across the tundra, driven by a hunger that never quite ends, searching for a green patch in a white world. They are walking into the bottleneck of history, and we watch them go, fading into the swirling snow, their forms becoming indistinct, turning into ghosts before they have even died. It is a slow, solemn parade of life refusing to stop, even when the earth itself has said, stop. The resilience of these creatures is heartbreakingly beautiful. They do not know why the ice returned. They do not understand the ocean currents or the atmospheric carbon. They only know that they must keep walking, one foot after the other, until the grass returns or the legs fail. And as the whiteout swallows the last straggler, leaving only a trail of disturbed snow that the wind begins to fill in immediately, we are left with the heavy, quiet realization that survival is not always about strength. Sometimes it is simply about being in the right place when the weather changes. And right now, for these confused and weary herds, there is no right place left. We turn our gaze now from the silent, suffering majesty of the herds to the small, flickering points of orange light that dot the darkening landscape, the fragile beacons of the only creature that refuses to accept the cold as a final verdict. These are the fires of the human tribes, the bands of hunter-gatherers who have spread across the continents during the warm years, following the rivers and the game into the heart of the north, believing that the ice had retreated forever. We drift down toward a camp situated in the lee of a limestone cliff, perhaps in what is now southern France or the sprawling plains of North America, and we are immediately struck by the mood of quiet desperation that hangs in the air like smoke. The easy, sprawling confidence of the summer camps, where tents were pitched in the open meadows and children ran naked in the sun, is gone, replaced by a tight, defensive posture against the elements. The people are huddled, pulled inward by the gravity of the drop in temperature, their bodies pressed close together, not just for affection, but for the stark, thermodynamic necessity of sharing heat. The false spring had seduced them into a lifestyle of relative abundance, allowing their populations to grow, their tools to become specialized for a world of forests and rivers, and their myths to settle into a rhythm of reliable return. Now that world has been pulled out from under them, and they are scrambling to remember the old ways, the deep survival strategies of their ancestors who lived in the true ice age. We see them reinforcing their shelters, digging down into the earth to create semi-subterranean floors, piling stones and sod against the walls of their skin tents to block the knife-edge wind that seeks out every crack and seam. The clothing has changed too. The lighter garments of the warm period are being frantically layered with whatever furs can be scavenged, but the hides are harder to process now, the tanning liquors freezing in the vats, the skins stiffening in the cold air before they can be worked soft. There's a sense of frantic improvisation, a race against a winter that arrived early and shows no sign of leaving. We watch a group of elders sitting by the fire, their faces etched with a confusion that goes deeper than the lines of age. They are the keepers of knowledge, the living libraries of the tribe, but their library is out of date. The plants they learned to harvest, the berries that should be ripening, the roots that should be sweet, they are gone or stunted or buried under snow. The migration patterns of the caribou and the bison, which they had memorized and taught to their grandchildren, have dissolved into chaos. When the young hunters return with empty hands and hollow eyes, looking to the elders for guidance, for a new plan, there's a terrible silence in the circle. The wisdom of the last 1,000 years, the wisdom of the warmth, has become a trap. Historians and archaeologists still argue whether this environmental stress caused a collapse in human populations or merely a reorganization. But looking at the shivering child wrapped in a rough piece of bison hide, the distinction feels academic. To this family, it feels like the end of the world. The cold is a physical assault, a constant thief that steals calories from the body every second of the day. We can see the physical toll in their movements. They are slower, more deliberate, conserving energy. The easy laughter and the storytelling that used to stretch late into the night have been curtailed to save breath and warmth. The nights are long, terrifyingly long, and the darkness seems to press against the circle of firelight with a physical weight. Inside the shelters, the air is thick with the smell of unwashed bodies, wood smoke, and the metallic tang of fear. They sleep in piles, a tangle of limbs and furs, the dogs curled in the center, everyone seeking the core warmth of the group. It is an intimacy born of survival, a dissolution of personal space that binds the tribe together in a single shivering organism. The spiritual life of the people is shifting as well. In the warm times, the spirits of the land were benevolent, generous, providing rain and sun in exchange for gratitude. Now, the spirits seem angry, capricious, or perhaps simply dead. We might imagine a shaman or a spirit talker standing at the edge of the camp, casting a handful of dried herbs into the wind, chanting a prayer that is half plea, half apology, trying to understand what rule was broken, what taboo was violated to bring down this punishment from the sky. Was it the hunting of the great beasts? Was it the forgetting of the old songs? The human mind, desperate for pattern and meaning, projects a moral narrative onto the indifferent climate, taking the blame for the shift in the ocean currents. This guilt adds a psychological burden to the physical hardship, a heavy cloak of responsibility for a catastrophe they did not cause. In North America, this period coincides with the twilight of the Clovis culture, the makers of those beautiful fluted stone points found across the continent. We see a napper working by the firelight, striking a piece of flint with a focused, desperate intensity. The stone is cold and brittle, prone to snapping unexpectedly, just like the world outside. The beautiful large points meant for bringing down mammoths are becoming smaller, reworked again and again as the stone sources become buried under snow or too distant to reach. The toolkit is shrinking, becoming more conservative, more efficient. Every flake of stone is precious. Every scrap of meat is sacred. We see the women processing bone, smashing the femurs of a deer to extract the marrow, that dense, fatty paste that provides the energy needed to keep the internal furnace burning. Nothing is wasted. The hooves are boiled for glue. The sinews are dried for thread. It is a culture of absolute scarcity. Yet, in this huddling, there is also a profound resilience. We witness small acts of tenderness that shine brighter against the backdrop of the freeze. A mother chewing a tough piece of meat to soften it for her infant, a man giving his portion of the fire space to an elder, a hand reaching out to squeeze a shoulder in the dark. The circle of the tribe contracts, but it hardens. The bonds between them are forged in the ice, becoming unbreakable. They are remembering that they are not the masters of the world, but its guests, and that survival is a team effort. The great cold forces them to abandon the individualism of the abundance and return to the collectivism of the crisis. We watch as they pack up a camp that has become untenable, moving out into the biting wind to find a better shelter, a herd, a sign. They walk in a single file, stepping in each other's footprints to save energy, a long, thin line of humanity threading its way through the white silence. They carry their fire with them, literally. Embers wrapped in moss and hide, carried close to the chest, a sleeping god that must not be allowed to die. If the fire goes out, the tribe ends. This simple reality focuses the mind, strips away the trivialities, and leaves only the essential truth of staying alive. They are walking back into the Ice Age, but they are walking together. The landscape around them is hostile, the wind screaming over the rocks, but inside the huddle, there's a heartbeat, a shared warmth that defies the drop in the thermometer. We leave them there, tucked into a crevice of the earth as the snow begins to fall again, covering their tracks, a tiny pocket of defiance in a world that has turned its face away. They do not know how long the winter will last, whether it is a season, a year, or an eternity, but they know that as long as the embers glow and the bodies are pressed together, they are still here. And in the silence of the prehistory, that persistence is the only victory that matters. We leave the shivering huddles of the snowy north and drift southward, riding the currents of the high atmosphere until the white blanket of the ice-choked plains gives way to the ochre and gold of the Near East, a region that history will one day call the Fertile Crescent, though in this moment the fertility is draining away like water from a cracked jar. Here, in the hills of the Levant, in what is now Israel, Jordan, and Syria, the catastrophe of the Younger Dryas wears a different face. It is not a face of snow and ice, but of dust, and a terrible, unrelenting dryness that turns the air into sandpaper. We are hovering over a settlement of the Natufian people, a culture that represents one of humanity's most daring experiments during the long, warm years of the false spring. Unlike their cousins in the north who followed the herds, these people had made a radical decision to stop walking, seduced by an abundance so profound that they believed they could stay in one place forever. They built permanent homes, round semi-subterranean houses with stone foundations and roofs of oak and woven brush, clustering them together in villages that felt like the beginning of civilization. For generations, the hillsides here were thick with wild cereals, emmer wheat and barley growing in such dense golden waves that a person could gather enough grain in a few weeks to feed a family for a year. It was a Garden of Eden, a paradise of easy calories where the gazelle herds wandered through the valleys in endless streams and the oak trees dropped acorns like rain. But now, the garden is withering. The shift in the Atlantic circulation has stolen the rain from the Mediterranean westerlies, and the moisture that used to water these hills is locked away in the freezing ocean thousands of miles to the west. We watch the village in the midday heat, which is no longer the humid, nurturing warmth of the past, but a sharp, stinging, dry heat that sucks the moisture from the skin, while the nights plunge into a bitter, frost-rimmed cold that shocks the plants and the people alike. The landscape is changing color, fading from the vibrant green of the rainy seasons to a dusty, brittle yellow that stretches from horizon to horizon. The wild grains, those reliable friends of the Natufian pantry, are retreating, shrinking back into the higher altitudes and the damper soils, vanishing from the easy reach of the village. The people are confused, for their entire culture, their architecture, and their tools are built around a promise of permanence that the climate is now breaking. We see a woman kneeling in the dust outside her stone-walled home, working with a massive basalt mortar and pestle, a tool so heavy that it takes 2 men to move it. This stone is the anchor of their lives, the symbol of their decision to stay put, but now it feels like a burden. She is grinding the seeds of the wild grasses, but the harvest this year was thin, the grains smaller and harder to find. The rhythmic thump, thump, thump of the pestle, which used to sound like the heartbeat of a wealthy village, now sounds slower, more hesitant, echoing off the dry canyon walls like a question that has no answer. The dust rises around her, coating her eyelashes and the rough stone of the house in a fine, pale powder. It is a crisis of heaviness. They have accumulated things, heavy grinding stones, heavy houses, heavy burials with intricate beadwork, and these things tether them to the land even as the land turns against them. They cannot simply roll up their tents and chase the rain like the nomads of the steppe. They are weighed down by their own investment in stability. We feel the tension in the village, a silent debate played out in the glances between the families. Should they abandon the stone houses? Should they leave the graves of their ancestors, which are buried right here beneath the floors of their homes, keeping the dead close to the living? To leave would be to admit that the experiment has failed, to retreat back into the wandering uncertainty of the deep past. So they stay, and they endure the Natufian pause, a period of cultural holding on, a stubborn refusal to let go of the sedentary life, even as the resources that supported it evaporate. The gazelle herds, the primary source of meat, are thinning out, their migration routes shifting in search of water, moving further away into the expanding deserts. The hunters return tired, their skin cracked by the wind, carrying fewer animals, their ribs showing the strain of the lean season that is stretched into a lean decade. The great lake that sits in the Rift Valley below, the precursor to the Dead Sea known as Lake Lisan, is shrinking visibly, its shoreline retreating year by year, leaving behind vast flats of salty mud that bake into hard white tiles in the sun. The air smells of sulfur and dry sage, a scent of desiccation. It is a landscape that is closing in on itself. We watch the children playing in the shadow of the stone walls. They are smaller than their grandparents were, their growth slightly stunted by the nutritional stress, playing games with pebbles in the dust, unaware that they are living through a bottleneck that will define the future of the human species. There's a profound melancholy in this pause, a sense of a people waiting for a rain that will not come. They dig into their storage pits, the plaster-lined holes in the ground where they keep the surplus grain, but the pits are echoing and empty. The surplus is gone. The gentle abundance of the Buling Olerud interstadial was a trap, luring them into a complexity they can no longer afford. Archaeologists still debate whether this pressure caused a social collapse or a tightening of family bonds, but looking at the way the villagers share the meager roasted gazelle meat, dividing it with agonizing precision so that everyone gets a bite, it seems that the stress is forging a new kind of discipline. They are being forced to look at the world with sharper eyes. They can no longer take the wild grain for granted. They must notice which plants survive the drought, which seeds are the plumpest, which soil holds the moisture longest. The pause is not just a time of suffering, it is a time of intense observation. The scarcity is teaching them to pay attention to the biology of the plant in a way that abundance never did. We drift over the drying wadis, the riverbeds that are now just tracks of gravel, and we see the wild almond trees dropping their leaves early, shedding their burden to survive the drought. The world is stripping down to its essentials. The Natufians are caught in the middle, suspended between the freedom of the hunter-gatherer and a future they have not yet invented. It is a moment of hesitation on the cliff edge of history. They polish their sickle blades made of flint, harvesting tools that shine with a sickle gloss from cutting thousands of silica-rich grass stems, wondering if there will be anything left to cut next season. The sun sets, a blood-red orb sinking into the haze of the western desert, and the temperature drops like a stone, the clear, dry air offering no insulation. The villagers retreat into their roundhouses, pulling furs over themselves, the stone walls radiating the cold of the night rather than the warmth of the day. They are the prisoners of their own architecture. The Natufian pause is a silent crisis, a slow-motion tightening of the noose where the choice is stark: change the way you live or fade into the dust. We feel a deep empathy for their stubbornness, for it is a very human trait to hold on to the life we know, even when the world tells us it is over. They polish their beads, they grind their meager seeds, and they wait, watching the sky with anxious eyes, hoping for the clouds to return from the west. But the sky remains empty, a vast, indifferent dome of blue steel. The Atlantic conveyor is still broken, the planet is still cooling, and the Natufians are alone in the drying garden, holding their heavy stones, unaware that their desperation is about to birth the single most important innovation in human history. The pressure is building, not of water against ice, but of hunger against habit, and something has to give. We draw closer now, zooming in until we are hovering just inches above the dry, cracked earth, focusing on a single cupped human hand, calloused and stained with the dust of the Levant. In the palm of this hand lies a handful of seeds, small golden-brown grains of wild emmer wheat, hard as gravel and seemingly lifeless. This is the pivot point of human history. Though it does not feel like a grand event, it feels like a gamble born of fear. The person holding these seeds, perhaps a woman whose name has been lost to the wind, or a grandmother who remembers the stories of the lush times, is standing at the edge of a drying wadi, looking at a patch of damp mud that has retreated far from the original shoreline. For thousands of years, her people have simply walked to where the grain grew, gathered it, and walked home. But this year, the grain did not grow on the hills. The Younger Dryas drought has burned the uplands to a crisp, leaving the wild stands thin and shatteringly brittle. So she is faced with a terrifying choice, one that runs contrary to every instinct of survival. She can grind these few seeds into flour and feed her hungry child for a single meal, or she can throw them into the mud, burying the food she desperately needs in the hope that the earth will give back more than it takes. It is a moment of profound hesitation. To bury food is to lose it, to surrender it to the worms and the rot, with no guarantee of return. We can feel the weight of the risk in the trembling of her hand. Then, with a quiet sigh, a surrender to the logic of the future over the hunger of the present, she lets the seeds fall. They scatter onto the wet soil, and she uses a stick to press them down, hiding them from the birds, covering them with a blanket of earth. It is not farming as we know it, with straight rows and plows. It is a rescue mission. It is an attempt to create a refugium for the plants that are disappearing from the wild. Archaeologists and botanists still debate whether this was a conscious act of invention or an accidental discovery, perhaps born from the discarded seeds of a garbage heap sprouting in the nitrogen-rich soil near the homes. But here, in the shadow of the crisis, it feels intentional. It feels like a partnership. The human is saying to the plant, "I will bring you water and protect you from the gazelle if you will stay here and feed me." The contract is signed in mud. We watch the days pass, marked by the slow, scorching movement of the sun. The woman returns to the patch every morning, checking for the green loops of the sprouting grain. When they appear, fragile and pale, a rush of protective anxiety floods her chest. She is no longer just a gatherer. She is a guardian. She pulls away the competing weeds, the bitter vetch and the thistles that would steal the precious moisture, engaging in a microscopic war for resources on behalf of her chosen grass. It is a new kind of labor, a toil that was unknown to the free-roaming ancestors. It requires bending, kneeling, waiting, and worrying. The weather, once a backdrop to movement, becomes a personal obsession. Will the rain come? Will the frost kill the shoot? The Younger Dryas cold is a constant threat, hanging over the tiny garden like a sword. We see the villagers carrying water in skins from the dwindling spring, pouring it carefully at the base of the stalks, a transfer of life force from the earth to the crop. It is an intimate, exhausting relationship, and in this process, something fundamental changes in the biology of the grain itself. In the wild, wheat has a brittle rachis, the stem that holds the seed, which shatters easily when ripe, scattering the seeds on the ground to propagate the species. But the humans, in their harvesting, unconsciously select for the plants that hold onto their seeds, the ones with tougher stems that don't shatter when cut. Over generations of sowing and reaping, the wheat changes, becoming dependent on the human hand to spread it. It is a domestication syndrome, a genetic rewiring that locks the two species together. The wheat loses its ability to reproduce alone. The human loses the ability to survive without the wheat. They are trapped in a mutual embrace of survival. We watch the first harvest of this cultivated patch. It is not a bumper crop. The heads are small, the yield is meager, but it is theirs. It did not require a 3-day walk to find. It grew right here, within sight of the hearth smoke. The feeling of cutting those stalks is different from gathering wild grain. There's a sense of ownership, a fierce pride, and a deepening of the attachment to this specific piece of land. This is my field, the thought forms, a concept that would have been alien to the ancestors who saw the whole world as a shared commons. The roots of the wheat go down into the soil, but the roots of the idea of property go down even deeper. The village becomes anchored not just by the stone houses, but by the sweat poured into the soil. We see the community gathering around the grinding stone to process this tamed grain, and there's a subtle shift in the social dynamic. The food is no longer a gift from the spirits to be found. It is a product of work to be defended. Storage becomes even more critical. Granaries are built with thicker walls, plastered to keep out the mice and the moisture. The Natufian pause is ending, transforming into the Neolithic revolution, though it is a revolution moving at the speed of a growing plant. It is a quiet, dusty revolution, fought with digging sticks rather than spears. We feel a gentle, wry smile at the irony of it all. The Younger Dryas, which tried to freeze humanity out of existence, has instead forced them to invent the very technology that will allow them to conquer the planet. The cold, by restricting the wild resources, has squeezed human ingenuity until it produced agriculture. It is a solution born of a cornered animal. We drift over the expanding patches of green that begin to dot the brown landscape around the settlement. They are small, irregular blobs of life, like emeralds set in a setting of rust. Other plants are drawn into this circle of protection: barley, lentils, peas, chickpeas, the founder crops that will sustain civilizations for millennia. But the cost is high. We see the bodies of the farmers, examined by future osteologists, showing the signs of this new life: arthritic knees from kneeling, damaged vertebrae from carrying heavy loads of grain, teeth worn down by the grit from the grinding stones. The Garden of Eden myth perhaps remembers this transition not as a gain, but as a fall, a departure from the easy, wild life of the gatherer into the hard labor of the tiller. By the sweat of your brow you shall eat bread. Yet, in the cool of the evening, as the woman looks out over her small, wavering patch of green against the backdrop of the hostile, dry hills, there is a sense of security that was missing before. The chaotic, unpredictable world has been pushed back just a few feet. There is a buffer now. The cold wind still blows, the ocean is still broken, but here, in the mud, life is under control. The seeds are safe, the cycle is managed. We watch the firelight flicker on the faces of the family as they eat the bread made from their own wheat, a dense, heavy, unleavened loaf that tastes of earth and smoke. It fills the belly in a way that the wild herbs never did. It is the taste of the future. The dependency is absolute now. If they leave, the wheat dies. If the wheat dies, they die. They are planted. The nomadic restlessness of the species is being bred out, replaced by the patience of the farmer. The first sowing is complete, not with a fanfare, but with the quiet satisfaction of a belly that will not be empty tomorrow. The Younger Dryas has planted a seed in the human mind that will grow into cities, empires, and nations. But for now, it is just a small patch of grass, shivering in the wind, held upright by the hope of a hand that refuses to let go. We rise up from the intimate, dusty geometry of the first fields, leaving the humans to their digging and their anxiety. And we expand our view until the horizon stretches out endlessly once more, drifting back into the deep, untamed wild, where a much larger and quieter tragedy is playing out in slow motion. This is the era of the great fading, the long, melancholic twilight of the megafauna, the time when the giants who had ruled the Pleistocene Earth for millions of years finally succumbed to the shifting weight of the world. It is not a singular event, not a sudden battle or a dramatic catastrophe that happens on a Tuesday afternoon. Rather, it is a gradual dissolving, a dismantling of the biological web, thread by heavy thread. We hover over the vast, chilling landscape of North America and Northern Europe, and we notice immediately that the land feels emptier, the spaces between the heartbeats of the ecosystem growing wider and more silent. The great herds are still there, but they are smaller, fragmented, drifting like broken clouds across a sky that no longer welcomes them. We focus our attention on the icon of this age, the woolly mammoth, a creature that is less an animal and more a walking landscape, a mountain of fur and muscle that has weathered the ice ages with a stoic, lumbering grace. We see a matriarch, her tusks curved like the crescent moon, standing on a ridge overlooking a valley that, in her grandmother's time, would have been a sea of nutritious steppe grasses and aromatic sage. Now, under the erratic climate of the Younger Dryas, the valley floor is changing. The dry, cold air has favored the spread of toxic birches and low-nutrient mosses, plants that fill the belly but starve the blood. She rumbles, a sound so low it is felt in the chest rather than heard, calling to a herd that has shrunk to a handful of sisters and calves. There is a confusion in her ancient mind, a map of food sources that no longer matches the terrain. The mammoth steppe, that unique high-productivity ecosystem that supported millions of giant bodies, is collapsing, replaced by a boggy, acidic tundra where the heavy feet of the giants sink and struggle. It is a trophic cascade in reverse. As the climate tightens, the calories disappear, and the giants, with their immense metabolic demands, are the first to feel the deficit. They are simply too big for a world that is becoming small. We watch a young calf, clumsy and endearing, tripping over a hidden root in the snow, a momentary gentle reminder that even in extinction there is innocence. But the mother nudges him up quickly, for there is no time to linger. The wolves are watching. The humans are watching. But the true enemy is the empty stomach. The extinction is spectral. It happens in the failure of a pregnancy, in the calf that doesn't survive its first winter, in the longer intervals between births. It is a mathematical death, a subtraction that happens so slowly that a single human generation might not even notice the decline. Scientists still fiercely debate the primary cause of this collapse, arguing whether it was the rapid climate change of the Younger Dryas that shattered their habitats, or the overkill of skilled human hunters arriving with their stone points, or perhaps a hyper disease carried by the newcomers. In our story, drifting through the smoke and the snow, it feels like a conspiracy of all three, a 1-2 punch where the climate weakened the giant and the human delivered the final quiet blow. We drift away from the mammoths to the shadows of the rocks where the predators wait, and we find them equally tragic. The Smilodon, the saber-toothed cat, with canines like serrated daggers, is a creature designed for a world of giants. He is a specialist, an ambush hunter built to wrestle bison and camels to the ground. But as the prey thins out, as the camels disappear from the Americas and the horses fade away, his magnificent weapons become useless liabilities. He cannot catch the swift small deer that are taking over the landscape. He is too heavy, too muscle-bound for the chase. We see him lying in the entrance of a cave, his golden eyes watching the empty plain, yawning with a mouthful of obsolete weaponry. He is starving not because he is weak, But because he is too perfect for a past that is gone, evolution has painted him into a corner. Across the ocean, the giant Irish elk we saw earlier has vanished, his antlers finally becoming too heavy a tax on his survival. The ground sloths of the Americas, the megatherium, creatures the size of elephants who could reach up and tear branches from trees, are finding the forests retreating faster than they can walk. They curl up in their burrows, their metabolism slowing, entering a sleep from which they will never wake. There is a profound loneliness to these endlings, the last individuals of their species. Imagine the last mastodon in a valley, calling out for a mate and hearing only the wind in the spruce trees. It is a silence that deepens the history of the world. The landscape itself begins to mourn them. There are trees, like the Osage orange and the Kentucky coffee tree, whose seeds were designed to be eaten and dispersed by these giants. Now, the fruit falls to the ground and rots, waiting for a ghost that never comes. The trees become anachronisms, biological widows left behind by the partners they evolved with. As we move through this fading world, we feel the shift in the scale of life. The monsters are leaving. The dragons are dying. The world is being handed over to the smaller, the quicker, the more adaptable. The deer, the wolf, the bear, and the human. The megafauna are becoming microfauna. There is a sense of the mythological era ending, the time when beasts could look humans in the eye and stand taller. The Younger Dryas is the closing of the storybook of the giants. In the far north, on isolated islands like Wrangel Island, a few populations of mammoths will hold on for thousands of years more, shrinking in size, dwarfed by their isolation. But for the mainland, the show is over. We watch the snow falling on the broad back of an old bison who has stopped walking, his breathing slow and shallow, the heat of his body melting a small hollow in the drift. He does not struggle. He simply lets the cold take him, returning his borrowed atoms to the earth. The snow covers him quickly, smoothing out the mound until it looks like just another rock, just another bump in the plain. The wind howls over him, singing the lullaby of the extinction. It is a peaceful, inevitable exit. The planet is resetting its inventory. We feel a deep, respectful sadness for these creatures, for they were the architects of the ecosystem, tramping down the trees, recycling the nutrients, shaping the very world we walk on. Their absence leaves a hole in the imagination of the planet, a vacancy that will never be filled. As the sun sets on the era of the megafauna, painting the sky in streaks of violet and blood orange, the shadows of the few remaining giants stretch out incredibly long, reaching across the miles as if trying to touch the future. But the future belongs to the small. The night falls, and for the first time in millions of years, the darkness is not shaken by the footfalls of the titans. The earth is quiet. The heavy breathing has stopped, and in the silence, the small fires of the humans burn a little brighter, illuminating a world that has suddenly become much, much roomier. The stage has been cleared. The giants have gone to sleep, leaving their bones to become riddles for the children of the sowers. Time becomes a flat white circle, a frozen wheel that turns so slowly it seems to stand still, grinding the years into a fine, indistinguishable powder of snow and ice. We have moved beyond the shock of the onset, beyond the panic of the transition, and settled into the deep, heavy stability of the 1,000-year winter. It is difficult for the modern mind, accustomed to the frenetic pace of changing fashions and fleeting headlines, to comprehend the sheer, crushing weight of 12 centuries of sameness. This is not a weather event. It is an epic. It is 60 generations of human beings, born, living, and dying without ever knowing a world that wasn't locked in the grip of the cold. We drift over a settlement in northern Europe, perhaps near the edge of the frozen Baltic Lake, and we see a people for whom the false spring of the Bölling Ollerud is no longer a memory, but a myth, a fairy tale told by the grandmothers to wide-eyed children who cannot conceive of a land without snow. They listen to stories of a time when the trees had broad leaves and the rivers flowed unfrozen all year round, stories of a sun that burned hot enough to make you sweat while standing still, and they smile politely, treating these tales with the same reverence and skepticism as stories of talking bears or spirits that walk on the wind. To them, the ice is the only reality. It is the solid floor of the universe. The Younger Dryas is not a catastrophic interruption to their lives. It is their life. It is the new normal, hardened into absolute permanence. We watch a young hunter repairing a harpoon, his movements precise, practiced, and devoid of the desperate improvisation we saw in the early years. He is a master of this environment, a specialist of the cold. His clothes are masterpieces of thermal engineering, tailored layers of reindeer hide and fur, sewn with watertight sinew stitches that are finer than anything a machine could produce. He does not fight the cold. He wears it. He moves through the landscape with an efficiency that borders on the supernatural, reading the nuances of the snow crust like a scholar reads a scroll, knowing exactly where the ice is safe and where the wind will turn. The anxiety of the great fading has been replaced by the stoicism of endurance. The culture has stabilized around the resources that remain, the reindeer, the seal, the hardy fish of the deep lakes. It is a leaner, harder world, but it is a survivable one. The chaos has been tamed by habit. We feel the stillness of the landscape, a silence that stretches for thousands of miles. The glaciers in Scandinavia and Scotland have stopped their frantic advancing and retreating and have simply settled, heavy and brooding, carving their valleys with the slow, patient erosion of deep time. The permafrost has deepened, creating a concrete layer beneath the soil that locks the moisture away, turning the plains into a polar desert. The dust storms still blow, but the people have learned to predict them, building their shelters in the lees of the moraines, digging deeper into the earth. The social structures have calcified, too. The necessity of sharing, of the tight-knit clan, has become a religious law. There is no room for the lone wolf in the thousand-year winter. Exile is a death sentence executed by the temperature. We see the rituals of the night, the sharing of the fire, the passing of the bone flute, the chanting of songs that have not changed a single note in 500 years. It is a period of intense cultural conservation. Innovation slows down because the margin for error is zero. You do not experiment with a new way of building a shelter when a mistake means freezing to death. You stick to what works. You repeat the wisdom of the ancestors. It is a time of stasis, a long hypnotic hibernation of the human spirit. Archaeologists note a standardization in the toolkits of this era, finding the same specific types of projectile points, small, sharp, easily replaced, scattered across vast distances, evidence of a unified solution to a singular problem. The diversity of the warm times has been pruned back to a single optimal strategy. Yet, there is a beauty in this harshness, a stark, crystalline clarity. We watch the aurora borealis shimmering over a landscape that is perfectly white, untainted by mud or melt, a pristine, frozen sculpture. The stars seem closer, harder, more brilliant in the moisture-free air. The connection between the human and the star is direct, unmediated by the soft haze of humidity. The cosmology of these people is built on the cold. Their gods are made of ice and wind, stern judges who demand respect and offer little mercy. We drift through the centuries, watching the layers of ice build up in Greenland year after year, centimeter by centimeter, trapping tiny bubbles of ancient atmosphere that preserve the chemistry of the cold. The carbon dioxide levels are low, the methane is low, the dust is high. The planet is holding its breath. It feels as though this could last forever. There is no sign of change, no hint of warming. The feedback loops, the ice albedo reflection, the sea ice extent, the dry atmosphere, are all reinforcing each other, locking the door and throwing away the key. The ocean conveyor belt remains sluggish, a weak pulse that fails to warm the north. The system has found a stable state, a cold mode that it seems perfectly content to maintain until the end of time. We see a funeral procession moving across the ice, a line of dark figures against the white, carrying a body wrapped in skins to be placed in a cairn of stones, for the ground is too hard to dig. They do not weep loudly. Tears freeze on the face. They place the body with its face towards the south, a subtle, unconscious gesture of longing for the sun that even 1,000 years of winter cannot entirely erase. The wind whips the fur of their hoods, but they stand unmoving, as enduring as the rocks themselves. They are the people of the Dryas, the children of the flower, and they have proven that humanity is tougher than the ice. But they are also trapped. They are surviving, but they are not growing. They are waiting, frozen in a suspended animation of cultural development, held in check by the calorie limit of the environment. The 1,000-year winter is a waiting room for history. It is a long, dark tunnel with no light at the end, visible to those walking inside it. We feel the heavy passage of time, the weight of the years piling up like the snowdrifts, burying the memory of the false spring deeper and deeper until it is forgotten entirely. The world is cold. The world has always been cold. The world will always be cold. That is the truth of the generation, written in the ice, whispered by the wind, and accepted by the heart. And in this acceptance there is a kind of peace, the peace of the stone, the peace of the deep freeze, where nothing changes, nothing moves, and nothing hurts anymore. We leave the frozen stillness of the surface world, sinking down through the cracks in the sea ice, past the sluggish gray waves of the North Atlantic, and descending into the crushing, absolute darkness of the abyss, where the only light comes from the bioluminescent flashes of strange, translucent creatures that drift like ghosts in the eternal night. We are returning to the scene of the crime, to the deep hidden machinery of the ocean that caused this long winter in the first place, to see if the gears are still jammed or if perhaps something is beginning to stir in the silence. For 1,000 years, the surface has been locked in the Younger Dryas cold, a reality that feels permanent to every living thing on the continents. But here in the deep, time moves differently, and physics is a patient, relentless worker that never sleeps. The lid of fresh water that the Ghost Lake poured over the ocean 12 centuries ago has done its job well, sealing off the heat and stopping the circulation. But water is dynamic, and it cannot stay separated forever. Over the slow march of the centuries, the rough winds of the Atlantic have been churning the surface, mixing the fresh water with the salt, gradually eroding the barrier that kept the conveyor belt from moving. It is a process of invisible dilution, a slow healing of the ocean's chemistry. But there is another, more powerful force at work, hidden in the balance of the planet's salt. While the North has been freezing, the natural processes of evaporation in the tropics have continued, relentlessly distilling the ocean water, removing the liquid and leaving the salt behind. This salty water, heavy and dense, has been traveling north on the surface currents, weaker than before, yes, but still moving, carrying its burden of density toward the sinking sites near Greenland. It has been arriving year after year, finding the door to the deep ocean locked by the freshwater cap, and so it has waited, pooling beneath the surface, increasing the salinity of the upper ocean layer by layer, grain by grain. It is a salinity buildup, a charging of the oceanic battery. The ocean is priming itself for a restart, accumulating potential energy in the form of heavy, salty water that is desperate to sink. We float in the blackness of the Labrador Sea, sensing the tension in the water column. It is like a spring being compressed, tighter and tighter, held back only by the lingering effects of the meltwater. The system is unstable. The ocean wants to turn over. It wants to breathe. The Atlantic meridional overturning circulation is not dead. It is merely in a coma, and the chemical signals for waking up are becoming impossible to ignore. There is also a thermal imbalance pushing for change. For the last millennium, because the conveyor belt has been broken, it has not been transporting heat from the south to the north. This means that while the Northern Hemisphere has been shivering in a deep freeze, the Southern Hemisphere and the tropics have been hoarding heat, warming up slightly, storing thermal energy in the vast reservoir of the Southern Ocean. Scientists call this the bipolar seesaw. When the north goes down, the south goes up. Now, that heat is pushing back, seeking equilibrium, pressing against the boundaries of the ocean currents. The planet is top-heavy with cold and bottom-heavy with heat, a state of thermal tension that cannot last. The ocean is a single interconnected body, and it seeks balance with the same inevitability that water seeks the lowest point. We imagine the water molecules themselves vibrating with this suppressed energy, a silent chorus waiting for the conductor to lift the baton. To a casual observer, if one could exist 3 miles down, nothing has changed. The dark is still dark. The cold is still cold. The pressure is still crushing. But to the memory of the ocean, the conditions are now radically different than they were when the dam broke. The fresh water is gone, mixed away or evaporated. The salt is back, heavier than ever. The heat is waiting in the south. The trigger is reset. It is a situation of conditional instability, where the slightest nudge, a particularly cold winter, a shift in the wind, a minor reduction in sea ice, could cause the entire system to flip back into action. It is the deep ocean holding its breath, waiting for the critical density threshold to be crossed. We feel a sense of anticipation, a low-frequency hum of readiness. The 1,000-year winter on the land has felt static, boring, endless. But down here, it has been a period of frantic, microscopic preparation. The engine has been rebuilding itself in the dark. We might see a deep-sea current slowly beginning to swirl, a lazy eddy of water that spirals downward, testing the path to the bottom. It sinks a few hundred meters, then stops, not quite heavy enough yet. It is a false start, a sputter of the engine, but the trend is clear. The water is getting heavier. The chimneys of the ocean, those vertical shafts of sinking water, are being reconstructed. The silence of the abyss is about to be broken by the roar of the waterfall that falls underwater. There is a profound irony in this invisible shift. The very cold that has plagued the north has helped to create the conditions for the warmth to return. By freezing the sea surface and creating sea ice, the ocean has rejected salt, for sea ice is fresh, dumping even more brine into the water below, making it denser, making it more ready to sink. The winter has been digging its own grave. The cold has been the architect of its own destruction. We drift through these silent, heavy currents, feeling the weight of the water above us, millions of tons of ocean that are poised on a knife edge. It is a reminder that the Earth's climate is not a linear dial that you turn up and down, but a complex, non-linear system full of thresholds and tipping points. It can absorb change for a long time without showing any reaction, the hysteresis effect, until suddenly it can take no more, and it snaps. We are at the end of the absorption phase. The sponge is full. The battery is charged. The ghost of the heat is knocking at the door of the deep. On the surface, the hunter still stalks the reindeer across the frozen steppe, the Dryas flower still blooms in the gravel, and the glaciers still sit heavy on the mountains, unaware that the floorboards of their world are about to give way. They live in the before, while we, drifting in the deep, can see the after gathering its strength. The deep ocean is the subconscious of the planet, processing the trauma of the past and preparing the dreams of the future. And right now, it is dreaming of heat. It is dreaming of the Gulf Stream rushing north like a liquid wind. It is dreaming of the ice retreating. We watch a single particle of silt drifting slowly down from the surface, a tiny messenger from the frozen world above. It lands on the seabed, adding one more grain to the sediment layer that will one day tell this story. But the layer of cold mud is almost finished. The chemistry of the next layer will be different. The oxygen isotopes are about to shift. The unseen shift is complete. The physics are aligned. The wait is over. The Atlantic, that great, moody, indecisive beast, has decided to wake up. And when it does, it will not happen with the slow geological grace of the tectonic plates. It will happen with the speed of a breaking fever. The heat is coming. The conveyor is starting, and the 1,000-year winter is living on borrowed time, though not a single soul on the surface knows it yet. And then it happens. It does not begin with a warning, a gradual softening of the winters over centuries, or a polite negotiation between the frost and the sun. It begins with a sudden, violent snap, a release of energy that feels less like a season changing and more like a fever breaking in the middle of the night, leaving the patient gasping and drenched in sweat. The deep ocean, having reached that critical threshold of salinity and density we watched gathering in the dark, finally turns over. The chimneys of the North Atlantic, the sinking sites that have been dormant for 1,000 years, suddenly roar back to life, the heavy water plunging down with the force of a collapsing building, and this motion yanks the chain of the global circulation, pulling the warm, salty surface waters of the south northward with a speed that is geological whiplash. The Gulf Stream, that great river of heat, is no longer a sluggish, confused current. It becomes a jet stream of thermal energy racing toward the Arctic, carrying the stored warmth of the tropics like a battering ram against the door of the Ice Age. The effect on the atmosphere is instantaneous and shocking. We are standing on the surface of the Greenland ice sheet, a place that has been a frozen desert of silence for 60 generations. When the wind changes, it shifts from the dry, biting katabatic flow of the north to a wet, heavy, blustery gale from the south, and for the first time in a millennium, the air does not smell of ozone and dust. It smells of salt, of open water, and of rain. The temperature does not climb, it jumps. It rockets upward with a velocity that defies the slow logic of the prehistoric world. The ice core records from this moment are so stark, so abrupt, that when scientists first saw them, they thought it must be an error in the machine, a glitch in the data. They show that the temperature in Greenland rose by as much as 10 degrees Celsius, 18 degrees Fahrenheit, not in 1,000 years, not in a century, but perhaps in a single decade. And some evidence suggests the bulk of the shift happened in as little as 1 to 3 years. Imagine the world you know, the only world your ancestors have ever known, transforming completely between the birth of a child and that child taking its first steps. It is a climate revolution. The sun, which had been a pale, distant coin in a hazy sky, suddenly feels physically heavy on the skin, burning with a new, terrifying intensity. The dust that had choked the atmosphere for so long is washed out by the sudden onslaught of precipitation, clearing the air, making the blue of the sky piercingly bright. The clouds change from thin, high ice crystals to towering, dark cumulus castles, bringing thunder, a sound that many of the people of the north may never have heard before, a terrifying voice from the sky that sounds like the breaking of the world. We drift south to the edge of the tundra, to the lands of the reindeer hunters, and we witness a scene of chaos. The snow, which had been hard as concrete, a reliable surface for travel and shelter, turns to slush in a matter of days. The sleds, which were the technological marvels of the age, become useless, sinking into the mire, dragging in the mud. The rivers, locked in ice for generations, do not melt gracefully. They explode. The sudden warmth causes the ice to break up all at once, sending massive jams of jagged blocks crashing downstream, scouring the banks, flooding the camps that had been safely perched near the water's edge for centuries. It is a violent awakening. The silence of the Dryas is replaced by the roar of water, water dripping, running, rushing, falling. The world is leaking. The permafrost, the frozen glue that held the landscape together, begins to rot from the top down, turning solid ground into a quagmire of mud and shifting earth. We see a family standing outside their skin tent, stripping off the heavy fur layers that have been the uniform of their people since time immemorial, their skin exposed to a wind that feels unnaturally, disturbingly warm. They look at the sky with fear, not relief, for in their cosmology, the cold is order and this heat is chaos. The spirits are not blessing them, they are shouting at them. The predictability of the hunt is shattered. The reindeer, adapted to the dry cold, are miserable in the wet heat, their coats soaked, prone to insects and rot. They move north frantically, chasing the retreating ice, leaving the humans behind. The plants are equally confused. The Dryas flowers, those tough little soldiers of the cold, are suddenly scorched by the heat, outcompeted by the grasses and shrubs that burst from the soil with a pent-up fury. It is an ecological release, a frantic race to claim the new energy. The birch trees, which had been hiding in the south, seem to almost run north, their seeds carried on the warm winds, colonizing the open ground at a breakneck speed. Scientists describe this transition as the most rapid natural climate change event in the geological record, a sobering reminder that the Earth does not always move at the speed of rocks. It can move at the speed of the weather. We feel the humidity rising, a sticky, heavy blanket that wraps around the world, trapping the heat. The nights no longer freeze. The fires, once the center of survival, become less critical for warmth and more for comfort and ritual. The psychological impact on the humans is profound. The stories of the 1,000-year winter are rendered obsolete in a single season. The elders' wisdom about how to read the ice is suddenly dangerous nonsense. The world has flipped from a solid state to a liquid one. We drift over the glaciers, those ancient monarchs of the mountains, and we see them sweating. Rivers of blue water course over their surfaces, diving into moulins that scream with the sound of falling water. The ice sheets are not just melting, they are destabilizing, lubricating their own bases, preparing to slide. The return of the sun is not a gentle morning, it is a blinding spotlight turned on a stage that was not ready for the show. The atmosphere is practically vibrating with energy. The storms are intense, fueled by the collision of the new heat with the lingering cold of the ice sheets. It is a time of weather violence, of gales that flatten the young forests, of hail that pummels the earth. Yet, in this violence, there is the undeniable pulse of life returning. The birds are singing, not the lonely croak of the raven, but the complex melodic choruses of songbirds moving north. The colors of the land shift from the monochromatic white and gray to a riot of green and brown. The smell of the earth returns, the scent of wet soil and growing things, a smell that had been locked away in the freezer for a millennium. It is a sensory overload for a species adapted to the sensory deprivation of the ice. We feel a strange mixture of exhilaration and dread. The warmth is good, yes, it means food, it means ease, it means growth, but it arrived with such ferocity that it feels like a weapon. The planet has snapped back to the interglacial state, the Holocene, the cradle of civilization. But the birth was traumatic. The door to the Ice Age has slammed shut, locked by the rushing current of the Gulf Stream, and the key has been thrown away. We are now in the warm room. The heater is on full blast, and as the sun beats down on the retreating snow, turning the white plains into vast shimmering lakes of meltwater, we realize that the stability of the cold was a lie. The only truth is change, and sometimes change does not crawl, it jumps. The people wipe the sweat from their brows, looking at a horizon that shimmers in the heat haze, and they take the first uncertain steps into a world that is dissolving under their feet. The winter is over, the long freeze is done, but the water is rising, and the consequences of this sudden fever are just beginning to flow downhill. The heat has done its work, breaking the back of the ice, and now the consequences begin to flow, not as a trickle, but as a deluge that changes the very shape of the map, rewriting the geography of the Earth with a pen made of liquid blue. We drift away from the sweating glaciers and the rushing rivers of the interior, following the water down, always down, towards the great basins of the world, where the ocean is waiting to reclaim what it had lent to the land during the long freeze. This is the era of the rising tides, a time when the boundaries of the continents are erased and redrawn, not over millions of years, but within the span of a single human memory. For millennia, while the water was locked away in the ice caps, the sea levels had been low, hundreds of feet lower than they are today, exposing vast, rich coastal plains that connected landmasses we now think of as separate. But now, the water's returning. It pours off the shields of Canada and Scandinavia. It streams from the melting spine of the Andes and the Alps, and it surges into the oceans, raising the volume of the global tub. We hover over the edge of the continental shelf, watching the waterline creep upward inch by inch, tide by tide, a relentless, silent invasion that never sleeps. It is a slow-motion flood that swallows the beaches, then the dunes, then the forests behind them. To the people living on these coasts, and many people live here, for the coast is where the food is, it is a confusing, terrifying time. The ocean, once a stable neighbor, has become a predator. We see a camp of Mesolithic fisherfolk on the edge of what we now call the North Sea, but to them, it is not a sea at all. It is a vast marshy plain of rivers, lakes, and rolling hills, a land historians call Doggerland. It is the heart of Europe, a rich green bridge connecting England to Germany and Denmark. But the heart is drowning. The hunters return to a spot where they speared fish last summer, only to find it under 3 feet of salt water. The paths their grandfathers walked are gone. The trees that once stood on the shoreline are now standing in the surf, their roots poisoned by the salt, their dead branches reaching up like skeletal hands from the waves, creating ghost forests that will be preserved in the peat for thousands of years. There's a profound melancholy in this loss, a sense of the world shrinking. The ocean is stealing the land. We watch as a high tide, driven by a storm on the swelling Atlantic, pushes further inland than ever before, breaching a natural levee and flooding a freshwater valley, turning a sweet meadow into a salt marsh overnight. The birds scream, confused by the change in the vegetation. The deer retreat. The people pack up their nets and their skin boats, moving higher, always moving higher, looking back at the smoking embers of their abandoned hearths as the water laps at the stones. It is a migration driven not by cold, but by the rising blue line. This is Meltwater Pulse 1b, a surge of water so massive that sea levels jump by meters in a century, a pace that is perceptible to the naked eye if you live long enough to watch the landmarks disappear. The land bridge of Doggerland is being strangled. The great rivers that flowed across it are widening into estuaries, then into bays, and finally joining hands to become the open sea. England is becoming an island. The connection to the mainland is severed, slowly, inexorably, until one day, the last strip of dry land is washed over by the waves, and the two populations, the British and the continental, are separated, destined to develop their own distinct cultures, unaware that they were once cousins walking the same earth. We drift halfway around the world to the Bering Strait, the gateway between the old world and the new, where the Great Bridge of Beringia has stood for thousands of years, a grassy highway that allowed the mammoth, the bison, and the human to walk from Siberia to Alaska. This bridge, too, is dying. The Arctic Ocean and the Pacific Ocean are rising to meet each other, their cold waters swirling over the grasslands where the herds once grazed. The door is closing. We see the water meeting in the middle, a turbulent mixing of currents that cuts the cord between the hemispheres. The Americas are now isolated, a lonely island continent that will drift on its own evolutionary path for 10,000 years. The families stranded on the eastern side can never go back. The families on the western side can never follow. It is a great divorce of the human family, a separation enforced by the rising tide. The knowledge of the other side fades into myth, becoming stories of a land of ancestors that lies beyond the water, a place that can no longer be reached. We feel the heavy finality of this moment. The planet is compartmentalizing itself. In Southeast Asia, the vast continent of Sundaland is drowning, its low-lying rainforests and savannas being swallowed to create the archipelago of Indonesia and the Philippines. Mountains become islands, valleys become straits. The animals are trapped on these new islands, forced to adapt to smaller territories or perish. The tigers, the elephants, the rhinos, they are marooned. The human populations here are squeezed onto the remaining high ground, forcing them into closer proximity, perhaps sparking new conflicts or new cooperations. Iki. Geologists and anthropologists speculate that these massive floods are the seed of the universal flood myths found in cultures around the globe, a traumatic memory of rising waters passed down through oral tradition until it became the story of a divine cleansing. But here, watching the water rise, it does not look like the wrath of a god. It looks like the mechanics of a melting ice cube. It is physics, impartial and wet. The sound of the world changes. The roar of the ocean becomes the dominant note, a background hum that reminds everyone of the water's power. The coastline is jagged, chaotic, constantly changing as the water finds new low points to fill. We see the formation of the great estuaries, the Chesapeake, the Thames, the river mouths drowning in the salt, creating rich, brackish nurseries for fish that will support the next wave of human civilization. The rise is a destroyer, yes, but it is also a creator. It creates the harbors, the bays, the sheltered inlets where ships will one day anchor. but for the people of the time, there is only the loss. We watch an elder standing on a bluff, looking out at an expanse of gray water where he used to hunt red deer. He points a gnarled finger at a distant island, telling his grandson that he once walked there without getting his feet wet. The grandson looks at the waves and cannot believe it. The past is becoming unbelievable. The geography of memory no longer matches the geography of the eye. The rise continues, relentless, season after season, until the great reservoirs of ice are largely depleted and the ocean finds its new level. The coastlines stabilize more or less into the shapes we recognize on our modern maps. The world has been reshaped. The continents are defined. The islands are cast adrift. The global tides have done their work, redistributing the weight of the planet, pressing down on the ocean floor and allowing the land, relieved of the ice's weight, to slowly rise back up in a process called isostatic rebound, a slow breathing motion of the crust that continues to this day. But the water is the victor. It covers 70% of the surface now, a blue mantle that hides the history of the Ice Age. Down there, beneath the waves of the North Sea and the Bering Strait, lie the stone tools, the fire pits, the bones of the mammoths, and the footsteps of the ancestors preserved in the anaerobic mud, a sunken Atlantis of the prehistoric world. We float over this submerged history, feeling the peace of the deep water. The violence of the melt is over. The roar of the waterfalls has faded. The ocean heaves with a gentle rhythmic swell, hiding its secrets. The separation is complete. The humans are now islanders, continentals, separated by the barrier of the salt. The world feels bigger now, for the distances can no longer be walked, they must be sailed or imagined. The age of the easy walk is over. The age of the boat has begun. And as the moon pulls on the new, fuller ocean, creating tides that wash high against the new cliffs, we understand that the earth has settled into a new equilibrium, a water world where the land is just a temporary refuge from the eternal, rising blue. The fever has broken, the sweat has dried, and the breathing of the world slows down, settling into a deep, rhythmic chest rise and fall that will define the next 10,000 years. We have emerged from the violence of the thaw and the trauma of the rising tides into a golden clearing in time, a period of climatic grace that scientists call the Holocene, but which feels to the living things on the ground simply like the long summer. The atmosphere, having thrown its temper tantrums, having frozen the world and then scorched it, now seems to find a comfortable chair and sit down. The wild oscillations of the temperature graph, which looked like the jagged teeth of a saw for so long, smooth out into a gentle undulating line. The Atlantic conveyor belt, that great engine of heat we watch die and be reborn, is now humming with a steady, reliable power, pumping warmth northwards with the precision of a Swiss clock, ensuring that the winters are cold but survivable, and the summers are warm enough to ripen the fruit. We drift over the heart of Europe and North America, and we see the landscape relaxing. The chaotic, scrubby vegetation of the transition, the desperate birches and the hardy grasses, has given way to the heavy, majestic confidence of the climax forest. Great oaks, elms, and limes now dominate the canopy, their broad leaves creating a deep, verdant shade that cools the earth and holds the moisture. It is the age of the wildwood, a continuous sea of green that stretches from the Atlantic to the Urals, a forest so dense and so old that a squirrel could purportedly travel from one end of the continent to the other without ever touching the ground. The air smells different now. It loses the metallic tang of the ice and the raw scent of the mud, replaced by the rich, complex perfume of humus, leaf mold, and pollen. The smell of a world that is composting and growing in a perfect, closed loop. The seasons, once fickle and dangerous, sign a peace treaty with the land. The rains come when they are supposed to, watering the earth in the spring. The sun shines when it is supposed to, baking the ground in the summer. It is this predictability, more than the warmth itself, that changes everything. The contract between the human and the environment, torn up during the Younger Dryas, is drafted anew. We see a village of early farmers, perhaps the descendants of those desperate Natufians or new migrants moving into the Balkans, and there is a new ease in their movements. They are no longer gambling with every seed they plant. They know, with a reasonable degree of certainty, that if they put a barley grain in the soil in April, it will be there in August. This reliability allows them to exhale, to stop looking over their shoulder at the northern horizon, fearing the return of the ice. They begin to build not just for survival, but for permanence. The houses become rectangular, larger, built with massive timber posts that are meant to last for generations. They are planting their feet. They are clearing the forest with stone axes, creating landnam, openings in the wood where the sunlight hits the wheat. The scar of the Younger Dryas has healed over, covered by the bumper crops of the Holocene. We watch the animals, too, settling into their new ranges. The red deer, the wild boar, the aurochs, they flourish in this mixed landscape of forest and clearing. The ecosystem is no longer in flux, it has found its balance. The Goldilocks conditions have arrived, not too hot, not too cold, just right for the expansion of life. It is easy, floating here in the golden afternoon light, to think that this is how the Earth is supposed to be, that this stability is the default setting of the planet. But we, the travelers of deep time, know better. We know that this tranquility is an anomaly, a rare sweet spot in the chaotic history of the climate. We are living in a pause between the ice ages, a brief, beautiful interlude where the orbital mechanics and the atmospheric chemistry have aligned perfectly to pamper the biosphere. Climatologists and geologists often refer to this period as the Holocene stability, though recent studies suggest it was perhaps more volatile than we once thought, with many cooling events and shifts in the monsoon. But compared to the roller coaster of the past, it is a flat lake on a windless day. The humans, blissfully unaware of the statistical improbability of their comfort, take full advantage. We see the smoke rising from thousands of hearths, not just in the Near East, but spreading into the river valleys of the Danube, the Nile, the Yangtze, the Indus. The seed of agriculture, planted in the desperation of the cold drought, now blooms in the warmth of the stability. Populations explode. The tiny bands of hunter-gatherers swell into tribes, then into chiefdoms. The surplus grain fills the granaries, and with the full belly comes the time to think, to dream, to invent. Pottery appears, fired in kilns that require the steady mastery of fire. Textiles become more intricate. We see a woman weaving a pattern into a piece of cloth, a geometric design that mimics the reliable repetition of the seasons, row after row, predictable, orderly, beautiful. The chaos of the prehistory is being woven into the order of history. The wild is being pushed back, not by the ice, but by the fence in the field. Yet, even in this garden, there are reminders of the power that sleeps beneath. We might feel a slight tremor in the ground as the weight of the missing ice continues to lift off the continents, a post-glacial rebound that occasionally causes a landslide or shifts a river course, a subtle nudge from the ghost of the glacier. Or we might see a particularly harsh winter that sends a shiver of genetic memory through the village, sending the elders scrambling to check the food stores, their eyes wide with the fear of the old cold. But the cold does not return. The Atlantic keeps pumping. The greenhouse gases, carbon dioxide and methane, slowly drift upwards, perhaps aided by the deforestation and the rice paddies of the early farmers, creating a gentle warming blanket that staves off the next ice age. It is a controversial idea, the early Anthropocene, suggesting that humans began terraforming the planet thousands of years ago, unknowingly keeping the glaciers at bay with their fires and their cows. Whether by luck or by labor, the result is the same. The door to the freezer stays shut. The world feels safe. We drift over the first true towns, places like Çatalhöyük in Turkey, where people live in honeycombs of mud brick houses, entering through the roofs, their walls painted with scenes of bulls and hunting, preserving the memory of the wild even as they domesticate it. The social complexity is rising. With stability comes hierarchy, property, conflict, but also art, religion, and trade. The long summer provides the energy budget for civilization. It is the incubator. We feel a profound sense of gratitude for this boring flat line on the climate graph. Without it, we would still be huddling in the caves, chasing the reindeer, too cold to write down our history. The Holocene is the mother of us all. As the sun sets, casting long golden shadows across the fields of ripening grain, the world feels held, suspended in a bubble of perfect conditions. The crickets sing in the tall grass, a sound of warmth, of summer, of life that isn't struggling just to stay warm. The moon rises, looking down on a planet that has finally stopped shaking. The drama of the Younger Dryas is over. The narrative has shifted from survival to living. And as the lights of the settlements twinkle on the dark face of the earth, mirroring the stars above, we realize that the greatest gift the earth ever gave us was simply a few thousand years of predictable weather. The storm has passed. The water has settled. The garden is open. We stand now at the very end of our journey, not on a prehistoric plain or beneath the waves of a rising ocean, but in a place that feels strangely out of time. A cold, sterile room filled with the hum of machinery, where a scientist in a thick parka leans over a long, translucent cylinder of ice. This is the library of the earth, the memory in the ice, drilled from the deepest, oldest layers of the Greenland ice sheet, pulled up from the darkness to testify in the light of the modern world. We drift closer, looking through the glass at the layers of frozen time, counting the rings like the pages of a book that was written before the invention of language. Here, trapped in the crystal lattice, are the tiny bubbles of ancient air, the fossilized breaths of the planet, preserved perfectly for 10,000 years. We can see the Younger Dryas right there. It is not a theory, not a myth, not a story told around a campfire. It is a physical scar in the ice. It is a band of dark, dusty material where the snow accumulation slowed, where the chemistry of the oxygen isotopes shifted violently, a tangible record of the moment the heat died. Looking at it, the chaos we witnessed, the bursting of the ice dam, the stalling of the ocean, the starving herds, the shivering families, is compressed into a few meters of cold, hard truth. It is humbling to realize that the entire drama of human survival, the near extinction of our way of life, occupies such a small space in the physical archive of the world. It reminds us that to the planet, we are small and our struggles are fleeting. But to us, looking back through the lens of science and imagination, this scar is a monument. It is the boundary line between the wild, unpredictable childhood of our species and the stable agricultural adulthood we now enjoy. We run our gloved finger along the smooth surface of the core, feeling the cold that radiates from it, a cold that is 12th out of 900 years old. It is a ghost touch. It connects us directly to the hunter standing in the snow, to the flower blooming in the gravel, to the silence of the empty steppe. The ice does not lie. It tells us that the Holocene stability we take for granted, the reliable rhythm of the seasons that allows us to build skyscrapers and plant corn and plan for retirement, is not an immutable law of physics. It is a gift. It is a fragile equilibrium held together by the flow of water and the balance of gases. The switch that flipped the world into the freezer, the disruption of the Atlantic circulation, is not a piece of ancient, obsolete machinery that has been dismantled. It is still there, buried deep in the ocean, humming quietly, waiting for the conditions to align again. We look out the window of this imaginary laboratory, out at the modern world with its lights and its highways and its confidence, and we see it differently now. We see it as a civilization built on a frozen pond, trusting that the ice will hold. We understand that the Younger Dryas was a lesson that the Earth tried to teach us, that the climate system is not a dial that turns slowly, but a switch that can flick instantly. It is a system capable of abrupt change, of shifting gears with a violence that creates a new reality in the span of a single human life. This knowledge is not meant to terrify us, but to awaken us. It gives us a deep time perspective, a humility that is often missing from our daily lives. We are not the masters of the planet, we are its beneficiaries. We are the lucky inheritors of the warmth. The ice core melts slightly under the lights, a drop of water trickling down the side. ancient water released from its prison, returning to the cycle. It is a reminder that everything flows. The ice melts, the water rises, the currents move, the climate changes. Nothing stands still. We drift back out into the night, floating over the modern landscape, over the cities that glow like vast constellations of artificial fire. We see the descendants of the survivors, us, sleeping in our warm beds, protected by walls, fed by supermarkets, comforted by the certainty of tomorrow. But deep in our DNA, buried under layers of civilization, there is still a memory of the cold. There is a reason we find comfort in the fire, a reason we huddle together when the wind howls, a reason we feel a strange, primal melancholy when the leaves fall and the winter closes in. We remember. Our bodies remember the great cold. We are the children of the huddle. We are the offspring of the ones who didn't freeze. As we ascend higher, pulling back until the earth is just a blue and white marble hanging in the silence of space, we see the North Atlantic, that dark, swirling engine, doing its work, pumping the heat, keeping the nightmare at bay. It looks peaceful from here, a beautiful, swirling abstraction of fluid dynamics. But we know the power it holds. We know the history it hides. The story of the Younger Dryas is the story of a near miss, a moment when the door to the future almost closed but was held open by the resilience of a flower, the endurance of a beast, and the ingenuity of a human hand holding a seed. The cycle continues. The pendulum swings, the ice waits. But for now, for tonight, the heat is here. The current is moving, the world is warm, and we can sleep wrapped in the blanket of the Holocene, grateful for the long, beautiful summer that has allowed us to dream. The story is not over, of course. The earth is still writing it, one layer of snow, one grain of pollen, one drop of rain at a time. But our chapter, the chapter of the remembrance, is closing. We have walked the frozen plains, we have seen the waters rise, and we have returned to the safety of the present. The ghosts of the mammoths fade into the shadows. The roar of the flood quiets to a whisper. The wind dies down, the ice sheet sleeps, and we are left with the quiet, steady beating of our own hearts, a rhythm that has survived the cold, a rhythm that continues, steady and strong, in the warm, dark silence of the night. The fire that has guided us through the dark is burning low now, its flames settling into a soft, pulsing bed of embers that glow like the deep, steady heart of the earth. The stories of the ice and the flood, of the shivering giants and the rising tides, are drifting away like smoke, rising up into the vast, quiet chimney of the night sky to become part of the stars. You are safe here, anchored in the warmth, far from the biting wind of the ancient steppe, held in the gentle, reliable arms of the present moment. The history is heavy, but you do not need to carry it anymore. You can set it down, let it sink into the soft ground of memory, where it will wait for you until you are ready to listen again. The breathing of the world slows down to match your own. In and out, deep and slow, a tidal rhythm of peace that washes over the shores of your mind. There is no more rushing water, no more cracking ice, only the stillness, the quiet, and the soft velvet dark that wraps around you like a heavy fur. The past has dissolved into a dream, and the future is a distant shore that we do not need to reach tonight. There is only now. There is only rest. Let the silence fill the room. Let the heaviness of sleep pull you gently down, drifting, floating, sinking into the deep, warm ocean of dreams. Sweet dreams.